Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight, before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Think about that quietly. Let the question settle, and when you're ready, allow yourself to drift into the story. The fluorescent lights in the basement of the municipal building hummed with a frequency that seemed to match the pulse of the sleeping city above. It was 3:17 in the morning when Detective Sarah Chun first ascended those concrete steps, her footsteps echoing softly against the painted walls that had witnessed decades of quiet dedication. The archive room stretched before her like a cathedral of forgotten stories, its metal shelves reaching toward a ceiling crossed with pipes that carried the building's breath through copper veins. Each file cabinet stood like a sentinel in the artificial twilight, their beige surfaces dulled by years of fluorescent exposure. The air itself held weight here, thick with the accumulated presence of 10,000 cases, each one a life touched by circumstances that required documentation, investigation, and ultimately, storage. The room's silence was not empty, but full, pregnant with the whispered remnants of testimonies given, evidence collected, and conclusions drawn in the patient rhythm of bureaucratic thoroughness. Sarah moved between the rows with the careful gait of someone who understood the sanctity of archives. Her fingers traced along the labels, each one marking a year, a category, a segment of human experience reduced to manila folders and carbon copies. The city above slept fitfully, unaware that its memories were kept here in this underground repository where time moved differently, where the urgency of yesterday became the patience of permanent record. The first cabinet she opened released a breath of aged paper and faded ink. The files inside were arranged with the precision of a librarian's devotion, each folder precisely aligned, each case number written in the careful script of clerks who understood that their work was monument building, one document at a time. The papers rustled with a sound like autumn leaves, dry and whispering, carrying the weight of testimony and evidence in their fiber. She selected a file from 1967, its cover worn soft at the edges where countless hands had lifted it from its resting place. The paper inside had yellowed to the color of old ivory, and the typewriter text had faded to a gray that suggested rather than declared the words it formed. The case concerned a series of break-ins on Maple Street, each one documented with the methodical precision that characterized police work of that era. The first report began with the date, typed in capital letters, followed by the badge number of Officer Thompson, who had responded to the initial call. His narrative unfolded in paragraphs that built slowly, each sentence constructed with the weight of official responsibility. He described the scene with careful attention to detail: the jimmied window latch, the disturbed items on the kitchen counter, the muddy footprint preserved on the white linoleum floor. There was poetry in his precision, a rhythm to the way he cataloged the evidence of intrusion into a family's private space. The second break-in occurred 3 blocks away. 2 weeks later, Officer Thompson's report noted the similarities with the measured tone of someone who had learned to let patterns emerge rather than forcing conclusions. The same window technique, the same careful selection of portable valuables, the same deliberate avoidance of personal photographs and sentimental objects. The criminal, Thompson observed, seemed to understand the difference between what had monetary value and what held the weight of memory. As Sarah read deeper into the file, the stack of reports grew beneath her fingers. Each incident was documented with the same methodical care, creating a narrative that emerged not from dramatic revelation, but from the slow accumulation of detail. The break-ins continued through the spring and into early summer, each one adding another layer to the pattern that was becoming visible to the officers working the case. Detective Martinez had taken over the investigation in June, his reports written in a slightly different style, but with the same fundamental respect for thoroughness. He noted the times of day when the break-ins occurred, always during the afternoon hours when children were at school and parents at work. He documented the absence of violence or vandalism, the way each scene suggested someone who entered with purpose and left without malice. There was something almost gentle in the criminals' approach, a respect for the homes they invaded that made the crimes feel more like trespass than violation. The summer heat pressed against the windows of the archive room, but down in the basement, the temperature remained constant, controlled by systems that understood the delicate requirements of paper preservation. Sarah continued reading as the night deepened above, following the careful progression of Detective Martinez's investigation. His reports revealed a methodical mind at work, someone who understood that solving crimes was often less about brilliant deduction than about patient attention to the small details that criminals inevitably left behind. The breakthrough came in August, documented in a report that was no more dramatic in its language than any other in the file. A neighbor had noticed a man walking regularly through the area during the afternoon hours, always well-dressed, always carrying what appeared to be legitimate business materials. The description was provided by Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, age 63, who spent her afternoons tending to her garden and had developed the observer's eye that comes from caring about one's neighborhood. Mrs. Walsh's statement was recorded in Detective Martinez's careful handwriting, each detail noted without editorial comment. The man was approximately 30 years old, average height, brown hair kept neat, wearing the kind of clothes that suggested office work or sales. He carried a leather portfolio and walked with the confident stride of someone who belonged wherever he happened to be. Most importantly, Mrs. Walsh had noticed that his visits to the neighborhood preceded each break-in by exactly 2 days. Pattern that emerged from Mrs. Walsh's observations was documented with the same methodical approach that characterized the entire investigation. Detective Martinez noted the correlation between the man's scouting visits and the subsequent crimes, but he did so in language that avoided sensationalism or premature conclusion. The facts were allowed to speak for themselves, arranged in paragraphs that built understanding slowly, like the careful construction of a legal argument. The arrest came on a Tuesday afternoon in September. The man's name was Robert Henley, and he worked as a door-to-door insurance salesman, a profession that gave him legitimate reason to walk through residential neighborhoods and observe the rhythms of family life. His method was patience itself. He would visit a neighborhood ostensibly for business, note which houses stood empty during the day, and return 2 days later when he was confident the patterns would hold. Detective Martinez's report of the arrest was written with the same restraint that had characterized the entire investigation. Robert Henley had been apprehended while attempting to enter a house on Elm Street, and he had offered no resistance when confronted. His confession was taken in the interview room on the 3rd floor of the station, recorded in longhand by Detective Martinez with the kind of attention to accuracy that made each word feel weighed. Before it was written, the confession revealed a man driven, not by desperation, but by a peculiar kind of professional curiosity. Robert Henley explained that he had begun the break-ins almost by accident, entering a house to use the telephone after his car had broken down, finding himself alone in someone else's space with the opportunity to examine their possessions. He described the experience as fascinating rather than thrilling. The way the objects in each house told the story of the people who lived there. He had never stolen anything of great value, focusing instead on small items that he felt would not be immediately missed. Loose change from a kitchen drawer, a fountain pen from a desk, a small vase from a mantelpiece. His purpose, he explained, was not really theft but exploration, a desire to understand how other people lived by examining the intimate details of their private spaces. The break-ins were, in his mind, a form of anthropological study conducted without the subject's knowledge or consent. Detective Martinez recorded these explanations without commentary, allowing Robert Henley's words to stand as they were spoken. The confession filled 17 pages of the detective's careful handwriting, each page a window into a mind that had found criminal expression for what might have been scholarly curiosity under different circumstances. There was something almost sympathetic in the way Detective Martinez captured Robert Henley's voice, as if he understood that crime sometimes emerged from loneliness rather than malice. The case file concluded with the paperwork of resolution. Robert Henley sentenced to 6 months in county jail, followed by 2 years of probation. The return of recovered items to their owners. The final reports that closed the circle of official attention. The break-ins on Maple Street became part of the permanent record, filed away in the cabinet where Sarah had found them, waiting patiently for someone to discover their story decades later. Sarah closed the file and returned it to its place among its fellow documents. The basement archive maintained its steady temperature and humidity, protecting the paper trail of human experience with the dedication of a museum curator. Somewhere above, the city continued its restless sleep, unaware that its memories were preserved in basement rooms where the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullabies through the night. She selected another file, this one from 1973, its label written in the distinctive print of Officer Davis, whose reports were known for their philosophical undertones. The case concerned a string of car thefts in the downtown area, each one documented with the kind of attention to social context that made Officer Davis's files read like sociology, text disguised as police reports. His first entry noted not just the theft itself, but the economic conditions that surrounded it. The way unemployment in the city's manufacturing sector had created a population of young men with time on their hands and limited prospects for legitimate income. The stolen cars were never expensive models. Officer Davis observed. The thieves seemed to prefer older vehicles, cars that could be started with basic tools and driven without attracting attention. They were not joyriders seeking excitement, but practical criminals who understood that transportation was a prerequisite for other forms of income generation. The cars would be stolen in the evening, driven for a few days, and then abandoned in neighborhoods far from where they had been taken, usually with empty gas tanks but otherwise undamaged. Officer Davis had spent considerable time interviewing the victims, and his reports reflected a genuine interest in understanding the impact of these crimes on people's lives. Mrs. Margaret Stone, whose 1968 Chevrolet had been stolen from the parking lot of the grocery store where she worked as a cashier, explained that the loss of her car had meant the loss of her job, since she had no other way to get to work. Her story was recorded with the kind of attention to human consequences that made Officer Davis's reports stand out among the more routine documentation in the files. The investigation had revealed a loose network of young men who were stealing cars not for profit but for survival, using them to travel to other parts of the city where they could find temporary work or opportunities for small-scale theft. Officer Davis wrote about them with a mixture of professional duty and human understanding, noting that the line between criminal and victim was often thinner than the law might suggest. His reports read like character studies, each offender presented as a complete person rather than simply a perpetrator. The case had been solved through patient observation rather than dramatic police work. Officer Davis had noticed that the stolen cars were always abandoned in the same general area, a neighborhood of empty lots and abandoned buildings where someone could disappear quickly on foot. He began spending his off-duty hours in the area, not in pursuit of arrests, but in an attempt to understand the geography of the crimes. His approach was almost anthropological, mapping the patterns of movement and behavior that made the thefts possible. The breakthrough came when Officer Davis realized that the abandoned cars were being left near a city bus stop that provided direct service to the downtown area where most of the thefts occurred. The criminals were using public transportation to return to their hunting grounds, and the timing of the bus schedule determined when the cars were abandoned. This insight led to the identification and arrest of 3 young Men who had been responsible for most of the thefts over the previous 6 months. The arrests were documented with Officer Davis's characteristic attention to human detail. Marcus Thompson, age 19, lived in a boarding house and had been unemployed for 8 months since the factory where he worked had closed. James Morrison, age 21, was supporting a pregnant girlfriend and had been turned down for jobs because of his lack of high school diploma. Robert Chun, age 18, was trying to save money to attend community college but could find only part-time work that didn't pay enough for both rent and tuition. Officer Davis recorded their stories without excusing their crimes, but with an understanding of the circumstances that had led to them. His reports became a study in the social conditions that created crime, each case a window into the economic pressures that pushed people toward illegal solutions to legitimate problems. The 3 young men were sentenced to community service and probation rather than jail time, a decision that Officer Davis noted with quiet approval in his final report. The case file included follow-up reports that tracked the 3 men's progress over the subsequent months. Marcus Thompson had found work at a construction company and had remained out of trouble. James Morrison had completed his GED and found steady employment at a warehouse. Robert Chun had enrolled in night classes and was working toward his goal of attending college. Officer Davis's final entry noted that preventing crime was often more effective than punishing it, but that prevention required understanding the human stories behind criminal behavior. Sarah found herself drawn into the rhythm of Officer Davis's writing. The way he had transformed routine police reports into meditations on human nature and social responsibility. His files were thick with supplementary notes and observations that went beyond the minimum requirements of documentation, creating a record that was both professionally thorough and personally engaged. The basement archive felt like a library of human stories, each file a book waiting to be discovered by someone with the patience to read between the official lines. The next file she selected was from 1981, a case of embezzlement at a local bank that had been investigated by Detective Patricia Williams, whose reports were known for their meticulous attention to financial detail. The case had unfolded over several months, beginning with minor discrepancies in account balances that the bank's auditors had initially attributed to clerical errors. Detective Williams's first report documented the systematic way she had approached the investigation, treating each discrepancy as a potential clue rather than an isolated mistake. The embezzlement had been the work of Harold Brennan, a bank employee with 32 years of service and a reputation for absolute reliability. His method had been elegantly simple. He would identify dormant accounts belonging to elderly customers who rarely checked their statements, transfer small amounts to accounts he controlled, and then cover his tracks by adjusting the bank's internal records. The amounts were always small enough to avoid triggering automatic auditing systems, and the victims were chosen for their likelihood of not noticing the missing funds. Detective Williams's investigation had required her to become something of an accountant herself, learning the bank's computer systems and understanding the flow of electronic transactions that had replaced the paper-based banking of earlier eras. Her reports documented this learning process with the thoroughness of a student taking notes, each new piece of financial knowledge carefully explained and contextualized. The case became a window into the changing nature of white-collar crime as technology created new opportunities for theft and new challenges for detection. The pattern that emerged from Detective Williams's analysis was one of almost mathematical precision. Harold Brennan had been stealing exactly $250 per month for over 3 years, distributing the thefts across multiple accounts to minimize the risk of detection. His total take was just over $9,000, an amount that represented a significant sum for someone on a bank clerk's salary, but was small enough, in the context of the bank's overall operations, to remain invisible to routine Oversight. Detective Williams had traced Harold Brennan's activities by reconstructing his daily routines at work, identifying the times when he had access to the computer terminals, and the types of transactions he was authorized to perform. Her reports read like a puzzle being solved one piece at a time, each small discovery building toward a larger understanding of how the embezzlement had been accomplished. The investigation required hundreds of hours of detailed analysis, work that Detective Williams performed with the patience of a scholar researching a dissertation. The confrontation between Detective Williams and Harold Brennan was documented in a report that captured both the criminals' resignation and the detective's professional sympathy. Harold Brennan had not attempted to deny the charges when presented with the evidence, instead explaining that he had begun the embezzlement to pay for his wife's medical treatments during her final illness. The cancer had depleted their savings and put them in debt that his salary could never eliminate, and the small monthly thefts had seemed like a temporary solution to an overwhelming problem. Detective Williams recorded Harold Brennan's explanation without editorial comment, but her report conveyed the tragedy of someone who had destroyed a lifetime of honest work through a series of small decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time. His wife had died 2 years earlier, but Harold had continued the embezzlement partly from habit and partly from fear that stopping would lead to discovery of what he had already taken. The crime had become a trap that he could not escape without confessing to what he had done. The bank's response had been to press charges while also acknowledging Harold Brennan's decades of loyal service. Detective Williams's final report noted that the case highlighted the vulnerability of financial institutions to crimes committed by trusted employees, but also the human costs of a healthcare system that could push honest people toward criminal solutions. Harold Brennan was sentenced to 2 years in prison and ordered to make restitution, but he had lost not just his freedom, but his identity as someone who had never broken the law. Sarah set the embezzlement file aside and selected another case from the same decade, this one involving a series of vandalism incidents at a local high school. The investigating officer had been Detective Michael Foster, whose reports were characterized by their attention to the social dynamics of teenage behavior. The vandalism had consisted mainly of graffiti and minor property damage, but the pattern suggested something more than random mischief. Detective Foster's investigation had begun with interviews of students, teachers, and staff at the high school, an approach that required him to navigate the complex social hierarchy of adolescent life. His reports documented these conversations with sensitivity to the way teenagers communicate, understanding that direct questions rarely produced honest answers, but that patient observation could reveal the underlying tensions that led to destructive behavior. The case became a study in the anthropology of high school life, with Detective Foster serving as both investigator and ethnography. The vandalism had been concentrated in certain areas of the school building, particularly the areas associated with college preparatory programs and advanced placement classes. Detective Foster noted this pattern without immediately drawing conclusions, instead continuing to gather information about the social divisions within the student body. His reports revealed a school where academic achievement was celebrated, but where students who struggled in traditional subjects felt marginalized and forgotten. The breakthrough in the case came when Detective Foster realized that the vandalism was not random destruction, but a form of communication. A way for some students to express their frustration with a system that seemed to value only certain kinds of success. The graffiti, when examined closely, contained messages that criticized the school's emphasis on college preparation at the expense of vocational training. And the property damage was concentrated on symbols of academic achievement like trophy cases and honor roll displays. Detective Foster's identification of the students responsible for the vandalism was accomplished through patient observation rather than confrontational interrogation. He spent time at the school during different periods of the day, learning the rhythms of student movement and identifying the individuals who seemed most alienated from the mainstream academic culture. His approach was more social work than traditional police work, focused on understanding the underlying problems rather than simply punishing the symptoms. The resolution of the case involved working with the school administration to address the social conditions that had led to the vandalism. Detective Foster's recommendations, documented in his final report, included the creation of alternative programs for students who were not college-bound and the development of recognition systems that honored different kinds of achievement. The students responsible for the vandalism were given community service sentences that involved helping to repair the damage they had caused. But more importantly, they were given a voice in discussing the changes needed at their school. The basement archive maintained its constant temperature as Sarah continued reading through the files, each one a window into a different aspect of human behavior and social organization. The cases were not just records of crimes and investigations, but documents of community life, snapshots of the way people lived and worked and struggled with the challenges of their time. Detective Foster's school vandalism case was filed next to Officer Davis's car theft investigation, creating an accidental library of social history preserved in the language of police reports. The fluorescent lights above continued their steady hum as the night deepened into the early hours of morning. Sarah found herself drawn deeper into the archive, discovering cases that revealed the changing nature of crime and investigation over the decades. A file from 1992 documented a computer fraud case that Detective Linda Rodriguez had solved by learning programming languages and understanding the early days of networked computing. Another file from the same year contained Officer Thomas Lee's investigation of a shoplifting ring that had revealed the economic pressures facing single mothers during a recession. Each case was complete in itself, but also part of a larger story about the city and its people. The way social changes created new forms of crime and new challenges for the police who investigated them. The archive was not just a repository of solved cases, but a record of social evolution, documenting the way human behavior adapted to changing circumstances and technologies. Sarah realized that she was not just reading police reports, but studying the history of her community, one crime at a time. The night was beginning to fade toward dawn when Sarah finally closed the last file and returned it to its proper place in the cabinet. The basement archive would continue its patient work of preservation, maintaining the temperature and humidity that kept the paper records safe from the deterioration that time would otherwise bring. The stories contained in those files would wait quietly for the next person who needed to understand something about the past, ready to reveal their secrets to anyone with the patience to read between the official lines. As Sarah climbed the concrete steps back to the main floor of the building, she carried with her the weight of all those stories, the accumulated knowledge of decades of human behavior documented in the careful prose of police officers and detectives who understood that their work was both law enforcement and historiography. The city above was beginning to stir with the approach of another day, unaware that its memories were preserved in the basement archives, where the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullabies through every night. The stories would continue to accumulate, case by case, file by file, creating an ever-growing record of human experience preserved in the patient language of official documentation. Each crime was someone's story, each investigation a chapter in the larger narrative of community life, and each file a page in the book that would never be completely written, but would never stop growing. One case at a time in the basement archives where the city kept its secrets safe beneath layers of silence. The typewriter ribbons of 1958 produced a particular shade of black ink that had faded over the decades to deep charcoal, giving the police reports from that era a gentle quality that made them easier to read in the artificial twilight of the basement archives. Detective Catherine Morrison had selected a thick folder marked with the year and the notation "Property Crimes, Commercial District," the label written in the precise block letters that characterized the filing system of that time. The folder's edges were soft with handling, testimony to the many times these cases had been referenced, reviewed, and finally relegated to long-term storage. The first report in the sequence bore the header of case number 580147, typed on official letterhead that proclaimed the authority of the municipal police department, with a seal embossed into paper that still held the impression of bureaucratic solemnity. Officer William Henderson had been the responding officer, and his report began with the methodical precision that characterized police documentation of that era, when every detail was considered potentially significant and worthy of permanent record. The incident had occurred at Morrison's hardware store on 3rd Avenue, an establishment that had served the community for 23 years and held the kind of local reputation that made crime against it feel like an offense against the neighborhood itself. Officer Henderson's report noted the store's position on the street, its relationship to other businesses, and the fact that Mr. Morrison had operated it as both a commercial enterprise and an informal community gathering place where local residents came not just for supplies but for conversation and connection. The break-in had been discovered by Mr. Morrison himself when he arrived to open the store on a Tuesday morning in March. Officer Henderson documented the scene with careful attention to the physical evidence. The jimmied rear door, its wood splintered around the lock mechanism in a way that suggested the use of a pry bar or similar tool. The scattered merchandise on the floor, indicating that the intruder had searched through the inventory without regard for organization. And the empty cash register, its drawer pulled completely out and left on the counter beside the machine. What made the case notable was not the theft itself, but the careful selection that the criminal had exercised in choosing what to take. Officer Henderson noted that expensive power tools had been left untouched while smaller hand tools were missing. Paints and chemicals remained undisturbed, but screws, nails, and other small hardware items had been taken in large quantities. The pattern suggested someone with specific knowledge of what would be easy to transport and sell. Someone who understood the difference between conspicuous and practical theft. Mr. Morrison's statement, recorded in Officer Henderson's careful handwriting, revealed a man who was less concerned about the financial loss than about the violation of trust that the crime represented. He had built his business on relationships with customers who relied on him for both materials and advice, and the break-in felt like an attack on the community bonds that made such personal service possible. His description of the missing items was precise and thorough, reflecting the kind of intimate knowledge of inventory that came from decades of hands-on management. The investigation had proceeded with the methodical approach that characterized police work before the advent of modern forensic techniques. Officer Henderson spent hours interviewing other business owners in the area, creating a picture of the commercial district's rhythms and identifying the people who moved through it during the overnight hours when most crimes of this type occurred. His reports documented these conversations with attention to both the information gathered and the social dynamics that made cooperation possible or difficult. The breakthrough in the case came through the patient accumulation of small observations rather than any single dramatic discovery. Officer Henderson noticed that several other hardware stores in neighboring districts had reported similar break-ins over the previous months, each one characterized by the same selective approach to theft and the same focus on easily portable items. The pattern suggested not a random criminal, but someone operating with systematic purpose and considerable knowledge of the hardware trade. Detective Arthur Sullivan had been assigned to coordinate the investigation across multiple jurisdictions, and his reports reflected the challenges of police work in an era when communication between departments required telephone calls and written correspondence, rather than computer databases and instant information sharing. His methodical approach involved creating detailed charts that compared the various break-ins, looking for patterns in timing, location, and the specific items stolen. The charts, preserved in the case file as handwritten documents on graph paper, revealed a geographic progression that suggested the criminal was working systematically through the city's hardware stores, moving from district to district in a pattern that avoided returning to areas where police attention had been heightened by recent crimes. Detective Sullivan's analysis showed a mind that understood both the commercial landscape of the city and the operational patterns of law enforcement. The identification of the perpetrator came through the kind of routine police work that rarely made headlines but solved the majority of property crimes. Detective Sullivan had established relationships with the owners of second-hand stores and salvage yards throughout the city, places where stolen hardware items would most likely be sold. His patient cultivation of these contacts paid off when Edgar Paulson, who operated a used tool shop on the east side, reported that someone had been offering to sell him large quantities of new hardware items at prices that seemed too good to be legitimate. The seller was described as a middle-aged man who claimed to be clearing out inventory from a hardware store that was going out of business. Edgar Paulson had been suspicious because the man couldn't provide a business name or address, and because the items were clearly new rather than used merchandise. Detective Sullivan's report noted Edgar Paulson's careful description of the seller and his agreement to contact the police if the man returned. The arrest took place on a Thursday afternoon when the suspect returned to Edgar Paulson's shop with another load of stolen merchandise. Detective Sullivan had positioned himself where he could observe the transaction, and his report documented the careful way he had waited for the criminal act to be completed before making the arrest. The suspect was identified as Raymond Walsh, age 42, a former hardware store employee who had been laid off 6 months earlier when the store where he worked had closed due to competition from larger chain retailers. Raymond Walsh's confession, recorded in Detective Sullivan's meticulous handwriting, revealed a man who had been driven to crime not by malice, but by a combination of desperation and intimate knowledge of the hardware trade. He had worked in hardware stores for over 20 years, and losing his job had left him not only financially desperate, but emotionally adrift, cut off from the work that had given his life structure and meaning. The break-ins had been his way of maintaining connection to the trade while generating the income he needed to survive. His method had been based on professional knowledge that legitimate customers rarely possessed. Raymond Walsh knew which items were most valuable relative to their size and weight, which hardware was always in demand, and where stolen goods could be sold without attracting suspicion. He had planned each break-in carefully, studying the stores during normal business hours to understand their layouts and inventory systems, then returning at night to take only what he could carry and sell easily. Detective Sullivan's report captured Raymond Walsh's explanation without editorial comment, allowing the man's own words to reveal the psychology of someone who had found criminal expression for legitimate skills and knowledge. The detective noted that the case illustrated the way economic disruption could push experienced workers toward illegal activities, particularly when their specialized knowledge made certain crimes seem both feasible and justified. The resolution of the case involved not only Raymond Walsh's sentencing to 2 years in prison, but also the recovery of most of the stolen merchandise, which Detective Sullivan had traced through the network of second-hand dealers who had purchased items without realizing they were stolen. The detective's final reports documented the painstaking process of returning the recovered goods to their rightful owners, work that required matching serial numbers, comparing purchase records, and coordinating with multiple business owners across several police districts. The file concluded with a supplementary report from Officer Henderson, who had visited Mr. Morrison's hardware store 6 months after the arrest to document the long-term effects of the crime on the business. Mr. Morrison had installed better locks and a basic alarm system. But more significantly, he had changed his relationship with his customers, becoming more suspicious and less trusting of people who entered his store. Officer Henderson noted that the crime's impact extended beyond financial loss to include changes in the social fabric of the commercial district. Detective Morrison set the hardware store file aside and selected another folder from the same era, this one containing reports related to a series of check forgeries that had been investigated by Detective James Crawford. The crimes had occurred during the late 1950s, when personal checks were the primary method of non-cash payment and the verification systems that would later make such crimes more difficult were still primitive and unreliable. The forgeries had been the work of Helen Cartwright, a 34-year-old woman who had developed a sophisticated understanding of bank procedures and check processing systems through her work as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. Detective Crawford's reports documented her method with the kind of detailed attention that made the investigation itself read like a manual on financial fraud. Each technique explained and analyzed for the benefit of future investigators. Helen Cartwright had begun with small experiments, altering the amounts on legitimate checks she received and then cashing them at banks where she was not known. Her success with these initial attempts had led to more ambitious schemes, including the creation of entirely fraudulent checks using account numbers she had copied from legitimate documents that crossed her desk at work. Detective Crawford's reports tracked the evolution of her methods with the fascination of someone studying criminal innovation. Asterisk, the checks themselves were works of careful craftsmanship, created using the same attention to detail that Helen Cartwright brought to her legitimate bookkeeping work. Detective Crawford noted that she had studied the paper, ink, and printing techniques used by various banks, creating forgeries that were sophisticated enough to pass routine inspection by busy tellers who processed dozens of checks each day. Her criminal career represented the application of professional skills to illegal purposes. The investigation had required Detective Crawford to become something of an expert in banking procedures himself, learning the way checks moved through the financial system and identifying the points where forgeries might be detected. His reports documented this educational process with the thoroughness of someone who understood that effective investigation required mastery of the criminal's own expertise. The case became a graduate course in financial fraud, taught through the medium of police documentation. Helen Cartwright's downfall had come through the kind of minor oversight that often undid even the most careful criminals. She had used the same handwriting style on multiple forged checks, and a sharp-eyed bank manager had noticed the similarity when the checks came through his institution for processing. Detective Crawford's report noted that the manager's observation had been made possible by the volume of Helen's forgeries, which had created enough examples for patterns to become visible to trained eyes. The arrest and confession were documented with Detective Crawford's characteristic attention to the psychological dimensions of criminal behavior. Helen Cartwright had not attempted to deny the charges when confronted with the evidence, instead explaining that she had been motivated by the intellectual challenge of beating the banking system as much as by the financial gain. Her forgeries had been, in her mind, a test of her professional skills against institutional security measures. Detective Crawford's final report included a detailed analysis of the techniques Helen Cartwright had used and recommendations for banks to improve their check verification procedures. The detective had recognized that the case represented not just individual criminal behavior but a systemic vulnerability in the financial infrastructure that could be exploited by others with similar knowledge and skills. His report became a resource for bank security officers throughout the region. The basement archive maintained its steady environment as Detective Morrison continued through the files, each folder revealing another layer of the complex relationship between crime and community in the decades before modern policing techniques had transformed law enforcement. The reports were written in an era when detectives had time to investigate thoroughly and document comprehensively, creating records that were both police reports and social documents. A file from 1961 contained Detective Robert Parker's investigation of a burglary ring that had targeted homes in the city's most affluent neighborhood. The crimes had been notable not for their violence or drama, but for the sophisticated planning that had made them possible. Detective Parker's reports revealed criminals who had studied their targets with the patience of scholars, learning family routines, vacation schedules, and security measures through weeks of careful observation. The burglars had been led by Marcus Stevens, a former locksmith who had turned his professional knowledge to criminal purposes after his legitimate business had failed during an economic downturn. Detective Parker's investigation revealed a man who had recruited accomplices based on specific skills: a former alarm installer who could defeat security systems, an experienced driver who could navigate quickly through the wealthy neighborhood's complex street layout, and a fence who could dispose of stolen goods through contacts in other cities. The planning for each burglary had been extensive, documented in Detective Parker's reports with the kind of detail that revealed criminal enterprise operating at a near-professional level. The group had researched their targets by posing as salesmen, service workers, and delivery personnel, creating legitimate reasons to visit homes and observe security measures. They had timed their activities to coincide with family vacations, using information gathered from social conversations and newspaper society pages. Parker's breakthrough in the case had come through the patient analysis of patterns rather than dramatic police work. He had noticed that the burglarized homes all shared certain characteristics. They were located on corner lots that provided multiple escape routes. They had mature landscaping that offered concealment, and they belonged to families whose social activities were regularly reported in the local newspaper. The detective's methodical approach to identifying these patterns had led him to predict which homes would be targeted next. The arrest of the burglary ring had been accomplished through surveillance rather than chase scenes or confrontations. Detective Parker had positioned officers near the homes that fit the target profile, and when the criminals arrived to conduct their pre-burglary surveillance, they had been observed and followed back to their base of operations. The detective's report noted that the group's careful planning had made them predictable to an investigator who understood their methods. The confession of Marcus Stevens, recorded in Detective Parker's careful handwriting, revealed a man who took pride in the sophistication of his criminal enterprise, while also expressing genuine remorse for the violation of his victims' homes. He had viewed the burglaries as a form of skilled work, applying professional techniques to illegal purposes, but he had not considered the emotional impact on the families whose private spaces had been invaded. Detective Parker's report captured this complexity without judgment, allowing the criminal's own words to reveal the psychology of sophisticated property crime. The resolution of the case had involved not only the prosecution of the burglary ring but also the recovery of most of the stolen property, which Detective Parker had traced through a network of fences and dealers in other cities. His final reports documented the painstaking process of returning jewelry, artwork, and personal items to their owners, work that required coordination with law enforcement agencies across multiple states and careful attention to proving ownership of valuable objects. Detective Morrison found herself drawn deeper into the rhythm of the archive's documentation, the way each case file contained not just the facts of criminal investigation, but glimpses into the social and economic conditions that shaped crime in different eras. The reports were written by officers and detectives who had time to think deeply about their cases, creating records that were both practical documentation and inadvertent sociology. A thick folder from 1964 contained Detective Anna Rodriguez's investigation of an insurance fraud scheme that had involved dozens of participants and taken months to unravel. The case had begun with a suspicious fire at a warehouse owned by Thompson Industries, a small manufacturing company that produced furniture components for larger manufacturers. Detective Rodriguez's initial report had noted several factors that suggested the fire might not have been accidental. It had occurred during a period when the company was facing financial difficulties. The fire had destroyed records that would have been valuable in bankruptcy proceedings, and the building's insurance coverage had been increased significantly. Just months before the incident, the investigation had required Detective Rodriguez to master the complexities of commercial insurance policies, manufacturing economics, and corporate financial structures. Her reports documented this learning process with the methodical approach of someone who understood that effective investigation required expertise in the criminal's own field. The case became a study in white-collar crime conducted through the patient accumulation of documentary evidence. The insurance fraud scheme that Detective Rodriguez uncovered had been far more extensive than the warehouse fire that had triggered the investigation. Thompson Industries had been part of a network of businesses that were systematically filing fraudulent claims for fires, thefts, and accidents that had been either staged or completely fabricated. The scheme had involved insurance agents who falsified policies, adjusters who inflated damage estimates, and business owners who were willing to sacrifice their companies for immediate financial gain. Detective Rodriguez's investigation had revealed the scheme. Through careful analysis of insurance claims across multiple companies and insurance carriers, her reports documented the patterns she had discovered: similar types of incidents occurring at businesses facing similar financial pressures, damage estimates that were consistently higher than market values, and a small group of the same professionals involved in processing claims across different companies. The breakthrough had come when Detective Rodriguez identified Gerald Hoffman, an insurance adjuster who had been involved in evaluating claims for most of the suspicious incidents. Her surveillance of Hoffman had revealed meetings with business owners who later filed large claims, and her analysis of his financial records had shown payments that could not be explained by his legitimate income. The detective's patient investigation had constructed a web of relationships that connected dozens of fraudulent claims across a 2-year period. Gerald Hoffman's confession, recorded in Detective Rodriguez's meticulous handwriting, had revealed a man who had begun with small compromises and gradually become the center of an extensive criminal network. He had started by slightly inflating legitimate claims to help struggling business owners, but the success of these minor frauds had led to increasingly ambitious schemes involving completely fabricated incidents and businesses created solely for the purpose of filing fraudulent claims. Asterisk. The case had concluded with the prosecution of 17 individuals and the recovery of over $200,000 in fraudulent payouts. Detective Rodriguez's final report had included detailed recommendations for insurance companies to improve their claim verification procedures, and for law enforcement agencies to better coordinate the investigation of complex financial crimes. Her work had become a template for investigating insurance fraud that was still being used decades later. Detective Foster's investigation had required him to trace Marcus Thompson's activities across multiple states, coordinating with law enforcement agencies that communicated primarily through telephone calls and written correspondence. The case file documented the patient process of gathering evidence from victims who lived in different jurisdictions, each one representing a family that had lost money they could not afford to lose to someone who had exploited their trust and their desire for financial improvement. The fraudulent stock certificates had been printed by a commercial printing company in another state, where Marcus Thompson had presented himself as a legitimate businessman who needed certificates printed for a growing company that was seeking investors. The printing company's cooperation with Detective Foster's investigation had been essential to proving that the certificates were intentionally fraudulent, rather than simply worthless investments that had failed to produce the promised returns. Marcus Thompson's trial had lasted 5 days and had included testimony from 12 families who had purchased the fraudulent certificates. The trial transcript revealed the human cost of financial fraud, with witnesses describing not just their monetary losses, but also the way the crime had affected their confidence in their own judgment and their willingness to trust others who offered opportunities for economic advancement. The case had become a study in the social impact of white-collar crime on working-class communities. Judge Harrison had sentenced Marcus Thompson to 3 years in state prison and had ordered him to make restitution to his victims, though the case file noted that most of the money had already been spent and could not be recovered. The sentence had been considered severe for a financial crime during that era, reflecting both the judge's understanding of the harm inflicted on vulnerable families and the need to deter similar crimes that exploited the economic anxieties of post-war society. The courthouse basement storage rooms extended deeper into the building than Detective Torres had initially realized, with corridors that led to additional chambers where evidence from earlier decades was preserved in conditions that had remained stable since the building's construction. The oldest storage room he discovered contained evidence from cases tried in the 1930s and 40s, when the courthouse had been the center of legal activity for a much smaller city that was still recovering from the economic disruption of the Great Depression. Evidence box 1938 M0156 contained materials related to a murder case that had captured the city's attention during the summer of that year. The case had involved the death of Harold Morrison, a businessman who had been found in his office after hours with injuries that the coroner had determined could not have been accidental. Detective Catherine Williams had led the investigation with the thoroughness that serious crimes demanded during an era when murder was rare, enough to warrant extensive resources and community attention. The evidence box contained photographs of the crime scene that had been taken with the large format cameras that police departments used before more portable equipment became available. The photographs were mounted on heavy cardboard and showed Harold Morrison's office in meticulous detail, documenting not just the position of the body, but also the arrangement of furniture, papers, and personal items that might provide clues about what had happened during the final hours of his life. Detective Williams's investigation had revealed that Harold Morrison had been involved in a business dispute with his partner, James Patterson, over the direction of their small manufacturing company. The dispute had centered on Patterson's desire to expand production, while Morrison preferred to maintain their current operations rather than taking on the debt that expansion would require. The disagreement had intensified during the months before Morrison's death, as the partners had struggled to make decisions about their company's future. The case had been solved through Detective Williams's patient analysis of financial records that revealed James Patterson had been secretly borrowing money against the company's assets without Harold Morrison's knowledge or consent. When Morrison had discovered these unauthorized loans, he had threatened to dissolve the partnership and report Patterson's actions to the authorities, creating a motive for violence that Patterson had eventually acted upon during a confrontation in Morrison's office. James Patterson's confession, contained in the evidence box, had been written in the careful script of someone who understood the gravity of what he was admitting. His statement described not a premeditated murder, but a violent argument that had escalated beyond either man's control when Morrison had threatened to destroy Patterson's reputation and financial future by exposing the unauthorized borrowing. The confession revealed a man who had made increasingly desperate decisions to save a business that was failing despite his best efforts. Trial had been conducted with the formal procedures that characterized murder cases during that era, when capital punishment was a possible sentence and judges, attorneys, and juries approached such proceedings with the solemnity that life and death decisions required. The trial transcript documented 6 days of testimony that explored not just the evidence against James Patterson, but also the economic pressures that had led to his criminal behavior and the business practices that had made such conflicts possible. Judge Shun had sentenced James Patterson to life imprisonment after the jury had recommended mercy based on their finding that the murder had not been premeditated, but had resulted from a business dispute that had escalated beyond rational control. The case file contained correspondence between the judge and Patterson's family that revealed the human consequences of violent crime for everyone involved, including the families of both victim and perpetrator, who had to live with the results of decisions made during moments of uncontrolled anger. Detective Torres found himself drawn deeper into the basement storage areas, discovering chambers that seemed to extend infinitely beneath the courthouse's foundation. Each room contained evidence from different eras of the city's legal history, creating an underground museum of criminal justice that documented the evolution of both crime and law enforcement through decades of social change. The preservation conditions in these rooms had been maintained with the same care that was given to the court records above, ensuring that physical evidence would remain available for future review or research. Evidence box 1934F089 contained materials related to a bank robbery that had occurred during the depths of the Great Depression, when economic desperation had driven some people to crimes that would have been unthinkable during periods of greater prosperity. The robbery had been committed by 3 men who had entered the First National Bank during business hours and had escaped with approximately $8,000, a sum that represented enormous wealth for unemployed workers, but was small enough in the context of bank operations to suggest criminals who were motivated more by desperation than by sophisticated criminal planning. Detective Paul Richardson had investigated the case with the limited resources that were available to police departments during the 1930s, when forensic science was primitive and communication between law enforcement agencies was difficult and time-consuming. His investigation had relied on witness interviews, physical evidence analysis using methods that were advanced for their time, but crude by modern standards, and the patient process of following leads that often resulted in dead ends, but occasionally produced breakthrough discoveries. The bank robbery had been notable for the restraint that the criminals had shown during the commission of their crime. Witness statements contained in the evidence box revealed that the 3 men had been polite to customers and bank employees, had made no threats of violence beyond the implicit intimidation of their weapons, and had completed their theft quickly and efficiently before leaving the bank through the front door and disappearing into the network of alleys and side streets that connected the commercial district to residential neighborhoods where they could blend into the population. Detective Richardson's investigation had eventually identified the 3 robbers as Thomas Chun, Robert Morrison, and James Walsh, unemployed factory workers who had been laid off when the manufacturing company where they worked had closed during the economic downturn. Their criminal plan had been simple but effective. They had studied the bank's operations during legitimate visits to conduct personal business, had identified the time of day when the maximum amount of cash would be available with the minimum number of people present, and had executed their robbery with the efficiency of men who understood that success depended on speed and preparation, rather than violence or intimidation. The arrests had been made 3 weeks after the robbery, when James Walsh had attempted to spend money at a rate that was inconsistent with his unemployed status. Detective Richardson's observation of Walsh's spending patterns had led to surveillance that revealed the location where the three men were hiding and dividing their stolen money. The arrests had been accomplished without violence, with all three men surrendering when they realized that escape was impossible. The archive's fluorescent lights continued their steady hum as Detective Morrison worked deeper into the night, surrounded by the accumulated documentation of decades of police work. Each file was a complete story in itself, but together they formed a larger narrative about the evolution of crime and investigation in the city. The reports were written in an era when thorough documentation was considered essential to effective law enforcement. Creating records that were both practical tools and historical documents. The night was approaching its deepest hour when Detective Morrison selected a final file from the 1950s. This one containing reports related to a kidnapping case that had captivated the city's attention but had been resolved through patient police work rather than dramatic rescue operations. Detective Francis Murphy had been the lead investigator, and his reports reflected the kind of methodical approach that had made complex cases manageable. Through careful attention to detail and systematic analysis of evidence, the case had involved the disappearance of 8-year-old Timothy Walsh from a playground where he had been playing with friends on a Saturday afternoon in June. Detective Murphy's initial report had documented the scene with careful attention to the physical evidence, the location where Timothy had last been seen, the timing of his disappearance, and the statements of witnesses who had observed the boy's activities throughout the day. The Plaza investigation had proceeded with the kind of comprehensive approach that characterized police work in an era when manpower was allocated generously to serious crimes. Detective Murphy had coordinated teams of officers who conducted door-to-door interviews throughout the neighborhood, searching for witnesses who might have observed anything unusual on the day of the disappearance. His reports documented these efforts with attention to both the information gathered and the systematic methodology that ensured no potential lead was overlooked. The breakthrough in the case had come through the patient analysis of witness statements that initially seemed contradictory or unimportant. Detective Murphy had noticed that several people had observed a man in work clothes near the playground at different times throughout the day, but their descriptions had varied enough that the witnesses had seemed to be describing different people. The detective's careful comparison of these statements had revealed that the variations could be explained by the same person changing clothes and returning to the area multiple times. The identification of the suspect had been accomplished through the kind of methodical police work that required both patience and systematic thinking. Detective Murphy had created a timeline that showed when the man had been observed at different locations, and this analysis had revealed a pattern of movement that suggested careful surveillance of the playground and the children who used it regularly. The detective's approach had transformed scattered observations into a coherent picture of criminal behavior. The arrest had taken place when the suspect returned to the playground 3 days after Timothy's disappearance. Detective Murphy had positioned officers throughout the area, and when the man appeared and began watching the children who were playing, he had been taken into custody without incident. The suspect was identified as Leonard Cox, a 43-year-old janitor who worked at a school in a neighboring district and had no previous criminal record. Leonard Cox's confession, documented in Detective Murphy's careful handwriting, had revealed that Timothy Walsh was being held in an abandoned building that Cox had access to through his work. The boy had been kept in a room that Cox had prepared with food, water, and blankets, and while he had been frightened, he had not been physically harmed. Detective Murphy's report noted that Cox's motivation appeared to be loneliness rather than any intention to harm the child. Though this did not diminish the seriousness of the crime or its impact on the victim and his family, the rescue of Timothy Walsh had been accomplished without drama or violence, with Detective Murphy and other officers simply arriving at the abandoned building and taking the boy into protective custody. The detective's report documented the reunion between Timothy and his parents with attention to the key emotional impact of the crime on all involved, noting that successful resolution of such cases required attention to the psychological welfare of victims as well as the prosecution of criminals. The case file concluded with follow-up reports that tracked Timothy Walsh's recovery and Leonard Cox's sentencing to 15 years in prison. Detective Murphy had included recommendations for improving playground security and community awareness programs that could help prevent similar crimes, demonstrating the kind of comprehensive approach to law enforcement that considered crime prevention as important as criminal prosecution. As Detective Morrison closed the final file and returned it to its proper place in the cabinet, the basement archive continued its patient work of preservation, maintaining the steady conditions that kept the paper records safe from the deterioration that time would otherwise bring. The reports would remain available for future investigators, researchers, and anyone else who needed to understand how crimes had been committed and solved in earlier eras. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm as the archive settled into the quiet hours before dawn, surrounded by thousands of files that contained the documented memory of the city's encounter with crime and its resolution through patient police work. Each report was a testament to the officers and detectives who had understood that their job was not just to solve crimes but to document thoroughly for the benefit of future generations of law enforcement professionals. The stories preserved in the basement archives would continue to wait patiently for readers who could appreciate both their practical value as police records and their inadvertent contribution to the social history of the community they served. One carefully documented case at a time. Asterisk. The metal filing cabinets in the furthest corner of the basement archive bore the patina of age that spoke of decades spent in patient service. Their beige surfaces dulled to the color of old parchment and marked with the small dents and scratches that accumulated through years of careful use. Detective Elizabeth Harper had discovered these older sections during her third night in the archives, following a narrow corridor that led away from the main storage area into chambers that seemed forgotten by everyone, except the building's heating system, which maintained the same careful temperature control that preserved the more frequently accessed files. Here, in cabinets that required keys kept in a dusty box marked with the faded notation, historical files. Pre-1950, the police reports took on a different character entirely. The paper was heavier, with the substantial weight that suggested quality and permanence. And the typewriting had been done on machines that struck each letter with enough force to create impressions that could be felt on the reverse side of the page. These were documents created in an era when permanence was assumed, when the idea that records might someday be digitized or transferred to other media was as foreign as the concept of crimes that existed only in electronic form. The first cabinet she opened released a breath of air that carried the scent of old paper and metal polish, along with something else that might have been the accumulated presence of all the hands that had filed these documents with the reverence due to permanent records. The folders inside were arranged with mathematical precision, each one labeled in the careful script of clerks who understood that their handwriting would outlive them, becoming part of the permanent record of their dedication to the work of preservation. Detective Harper selected a folder marked Case 470023 Commercial Burglary, and found herself holding a document that predated her birth by decades. A window into police work conducted in an era when investigation proceeded at the pace of human conversation and careful observation rather than electronic analysis and database searches. The report had been typed on paper that bore the watermark of a local printing company that had closed before she had entered elementary school, connecting her to a chain of commerce and craftsmanship that stretched back into the city's industrial past. The investigating officer had been Detective Thomas Brennan, whose name appeared on dozens of files from the 1940s and early 50s, and whose reports were characterized by a prose style that suggested someone who had learned to write by reading literature as well as police manuals. His description of the crime scene at Hartwell's dry goods store painted a picture not just of evidence and clues, but of a business that had served the community for 3 generations. Its shelves lined with merchandise that represented the practical needs and modest luxuries of working families during the post-war years. Asterisk. Detective Brennan had approached the investigation with the unhurried thoroughness that characterized police work in an era when cases were expected to be solved through patience rather than technology. His first report documented not just the physical evidence of the break-in, but the social context that surrounded it, the store's position in the neighborhood's commercial life, its relationship with customers who often bought on credit during difficult times, and its role as an informal community center where people gathered to exchange news and gossip along with goods and services. The burglary itself had been notable for its restraint and selectivity. Detective Brennan's careful inventory of the missing merchandise revealed that the criminal had taken only items that could be easily transported and sold without arousing suspicion: men's work shirts, women's stockings, children's shoes, and small household items like soap, razors, and sewing supplies. More valuable items like wool coats and formal dresses had been left untouched, suggesting someone who understood the difference between what could be stolen safely and what would attract unwanted attention. Mrs. Catherine Hartwell's statement, recorded in Detective Brennan's flowing script, revealed a woman who had been running the store since her husband's death 2 years earlier and who knew not just her inventory but the personal circumstances of most of her customers. She had noticed that the missing items were exactly the kinds of things that people needed most urgently when they had no money to buy them legitimately, leading her to speculate that the thief might be someone she knew, someone whose desperation had overcome their respect for her family's business. Detective Brennan's investigation had proceeded through the kind of community-based police work that required intimate knowledge of neighborhood relationships and social dynamics. His reports documented conversations with customers, suppliers, and other business owners, each interview conducted with the patience of someone who understood that information emerged gradually through careful listening rather than aggressive questioning. The detective had created a portrait of the community that surrounded Hartwell's dry goods store, identifying the currents of need and opportunity that made certain crimes more likely than others. The breakthrough in the case had come through Mrs. Hartwell's own observation rather than traditional detective work. She had noticed that Margaret Flynn, a young mother whose husband had been injured in a factory accident 3 months earlier, had begun wearing new clothes and buying items for her children that seemed inconsistent with her family's straitened circumstances. Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned this observation to Detective Brennan not as an accusation but as a puzzle that troubled her maternal instincts about the family she served. Detective Brennan's subsequent investigation of Margaret Flynn had been conducted with the delicacy that the situation required. Rather than confronting her directly, he had spent time observing her daily routines and talking with neighbors who might provide insight into her family's circumstances without violating the privacy that people deserved even when they were suspected of crimes. His reports documented this careful approach with attention to both the need for justice and the importance of preserving community relationships that would continue long after the case was resolved. The confession, when it came, had been prompted not by pressure, but by Margaret Flynn's own guilt about stealing from a woman who had often extended credit to her family during difficult times. Detective Brennan's report captured her explanation with sympathy for the circumstances that had driven her to crime, Her husband's injury had left them with no income and mounting medical bills. Their landlord was threatening eviction, and her children needed warm clothes for the approaching winter. The stolen merchandise had been sold to support her family, but the weight of betraying Mrs. Hartwell's trust had made the crime feel worse than the poverty that had motivated it. The resolution of the case had been accomplished through community involvement rather than formal legal proceedings. Detective Brennan had facilitated conversations between Margaret, Flynn, and Mrs. Hartwell that resulted in an arrangement for the stolen merchandise to be paid for over time, with Margaret Flynn working part-time in the store to earn both money and the opportunity to restore her relationship with a woman who had been both victim and friend. The detective's final report noted that the case illustrated the way crime could emerge from social problems that required community solutions rather than purely legal ones. Detective Harper set the Hartwell case aside and selected another folder from the same era, this one containing reports related to a series of automobile thefts that had been investigated by Detective Raymond Foster during the late 1940s. The cars in question had been stolen from residential driveways and parking areas near the city's growing suburbs, where returning veterans were establishing families and building the kind of middle-class life that required reliable transportation for work and family responsibilities. Detective Foster's reports reflected the challenges of investigating crime in a rapidly changing social landscape. The city was growing quickly as soldiers returned from the war and took advantage of government programs that made home ownership and education possible for people whose parents had never had such opportunities. The new suburbs represented prosperity and stability, but they also created new forms of vulnerability as valuable possessions like automobiles were left in areas where informal community surveillance was not yet established. The stolen cars had all been relatively new models, the kind of vehicles that represented significant investments for families who were building their lives around the assumption that hard work and careful planning would lead to security and progress. Detective Foster's investigation had revealed that the thefts were being committed by a ring of criminals who understood both the technical aspects of automobile operation and the social patterns that made certain vehicles attractive targets. The leader of the theft ring had been identified as Samuel Morrison, a former military mechanic who had returned from the war with skills that could be applied to either legitimate automotive work or criminal enterprises. Detective Foster's reports documented Morrison's method with the kind of technical detail that revealed the detective's own mechanical knowledge, the specific techniques used to start cars without keys, the tools required to defeat the simple security measures of 1940s automobiles, and the timing necessary to steal vehicles without attracting attention from neighbors who were not yet accustomed to the rhythms of suburban life. Morrison's criminal organization had included two other veterans who brought complementary skills to the enterprise. James Patterson had served as a military driver and understood the road networks that connected the city to markets in other states where stolen vehicles could be sold without arousing local suspicion. Robert Chun had worked in Army logistics and brought organizational skills that allowed the group to coordinate their activities and manage the business aspects of their criminal enterprise. Detective Foster's investigation had required him to develop expertise in interstate commerce and automobile registration systems, areas of knowledge that were becoming increasingly important as crime became more mobile and sophisticated. His reports documented the process of tracing stolen vehicles across state lines and coordinating with law enforcement agencies in other jurisdictions, work that required patience and persistence rather than dramatic police techniques. The breakthrough in the case had come through Detective Foster's analysis of the timing and location of the thefts. which revealed patterns that suggested the criminals were using legitimate employment as cover for their scouting activities. Samuel Morrison had been working part-time as a mechanic at a garage that serviced vehicles from the suburban areas where the thefts were occurring, giving him access to information about customers' cars and daily routines that made him an ideal candidate for planning successful crimes. The arrest of the theft ring had been accomplished through surveillance rather than dramatic confrontation. Detective Foster had positioned officers to observe Morrison's activities at the garage, and when the criminals arrived to scout their next target, they had been followed back to the warehouse where they were preparing stolen vehicles for transport to other states. The detective's report noted that the group's systematic approach had made them predictable to an investigator who understood their methods and motivations. Samuel Morrison's confession, recorded in Detective Foster's careful handwriting, had revealed a man who had struggled to find legitimate employment that used the mechanical skills he had developed during military service. The theft ring had begun as a way to generate income while he looked for steady work, but the success of their initial crimes had led to increasingly ambitious plans that eventually became their primary occupation. Morrison had expressed genuine regret not for the crimes themselves, but for the betrayal of the trust that garage customers had placed in him. The case had concluded with the recovery of most of the stolen vehicles and the prosecution of all three members of the theft ring. Detective Foster's final report had included recommendations for improving communication between law enforcement agencies in different states and for establishing better security measures for automobiles parked in suburban areas where informal community surveillance was less effective than in older, more densely populated neighborhoods. The basement archive maintained its steady environment as Detective Harper continued deeper into the historical files, each cabinet revealing another layer of the city's criminal past, preserved in the patient language of police documentation. The reports from earlier eras were longer and more detailed than their modern counterparts, written by officers who had been expected to master not just law enforcement techniques, but also the social dynamics that shaped criminal behavior in their communities. A thick folder from 1945 contained Detective Maria Santos's investigation of a counterfeiting operation that had produced fake ration stamps during the final months of World War II. The case had required her to master the technical aspects of printing and paper production while also understanding the social pressures that had made black market goods attractive to law-abiding citizens who were struggling with wartime shortages and restrictions. Detective Santos's reports documented an investigation that had taken place in a city where everyone was making sacrifices for the war effort, but where the strains of rationing and regulation had created opportunities for criminals who could provide forbidden goods and services. The counterfeiting operation had been sophisticated enough to produce ration stamps that were nearly indistinguishable from legitimate ones, requiring expertise in printing techniques that suggested involvement by someone with professional training in graphic arts or commercial printing. The investigation had revealed a network that included Harold Winters, a printer who had lost his job when his company had converted to war production; Ellen Morrison, a grocery store clerk who had access to genuine ration stamps for comparison and copying; and Thomas Chun, a distribution coordinator who understood the social networks through which illegal goods could be sold without attracting official attention. Detective Santos's breakthrough had come through patient analysis of paper and ink samples that revealed the counterfeit stamps were being produced using materials that were available only through specific suppliers. Her technical knowledge had allowed her to trace these materials back to their sources and identify the individuals who had purchased them in quantities that exceeded what would be needed for legitimate purposes. The arrest of the counterfeiting ring had taken place during a carefully coordinated operation that involved federal agents as well as local police. Since the production of fake ration stamps constituted a federal crime that threatened the war effort, Detective Santos's reports documented the complexity of jurisdictional coordination and the way local police work had to adapt to national security concerns during wartime. Harold Winters's confession had revealed a man who had been motivated less by profit than by anger at the economic disruption that the war had brought to his life. His printing business had been forced to close when paper and ink became unavailable for civilian use, and the counterfeiting operation had been his way of using his professional skills to generate income while expressing his frustration with government regulations that had destroyed his livelihood. Case had concluded with federal prosecution for all three members of the counterfeiting ring and the discovery of thousands of fake ration stamps that had been distributed throughout the city's black market networks. Detective Santos's final report had included detailed documentation of the printing techniques used and recommendations for improving the security features of government documents to prevent similar crimes in the future. Detective Harper found herself drawn deeper into the rhythm of historical investigation, discovering cases that revealed how crime had adapted to the specific circumstances of different eras. A folder from 1942 contained reports related to a tire theft ring that had operated during the rubber shortage that followed America's entry into World War II. The investigation had been conducted by Detective Paul Richardson, whose reports revealed the challenges of enforcing laws against theft when the stolen goods were items that people desperately needed but could not obtain through legal channels. The tire thefts had been notable for their systematic nature and their focus on vehicles that belonged to people who were perceived as having more than their fair share of scarce resources. Detective Richardson's investigation had revealed that the criminals were targeting cars owned by businessmen, professionals, and others whose occupations were viewed as less essential to the war effort than factory work or military service. The theft ring had been led by Frank Patterson, a former tire dealer whose business had been forced to close when rubber became unavailable for civilian use. His criminal organization had included mechanics who understood how to remove tires quickly and safely, truck drivers who could transport stolen goods to markets in other cities, and dealers who could sell the tires to customers who were willing to pay black market prices for essential merchandise. Detective Richardson's investigation had required him to develop expertise in wartime regulations and rationing systems, areas of law enforcement that had not existed before the war but had become essential to maintaining social order during a period of unprecedented government control over civilian life. His reports documented the challenges of investigating crimes that were technically illegal but morally ambiguous, since the stolen tires were often used by people whose need was genuine, even if their methods were criminal. The breakthrough in the case had come through Detective Richardson's analysis of the distribution patterns that connected tire thefts in the city with sales of suspicious merchandise in other parts of the state. His patient mapping of these connections had revealed a network that was sophisticated enough to avoid detection by local law enforcement, but vulnerable to investigation that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Frank Patterson's confession had revealed a man who had been driven to crime by the destruction of his legitimate business and his belief that wartime regulations were unfairly favoring large corporations over small businessmen like himself. The tire theft ring had been his way of continuing to serve customers who needed his products while generating the income necessary to support his family during a period of economic disruption. The case had concluded with the prosecution of the theft ring and the return of recovered tires to their owners. But Detective Richardson's final report had noted the social tensions that had made such crimes possible and the need for government policies that considered the human costs of wartime. Regulations. His investigation had become a study in the way emergency conditions could create new forms of criminal opportunity while also generating new forms of social conflict. As the night deepened toward its furthest point from dawn, Detective Harper continued through the historical files, discovering cases that revealed the evolution of crime and investigation through decades of social change. The reports were written in an era when thorough documentation was considered essential to effective law enforcement, creating records that served as both practical tools and inadvertent histories of community life during periods of rapid transformation. A folder from 1939 contained Detective Helen Morrison's investigation of a confidence scheme that had targeted elderly residents who were struggling with the economic pressures of the Great Depression. The case had revealed criminals who understood how to exploit the social isolation and financial desperation that characterized the lives of many older people during a period when government support systems were minimal and family networks had been disrupted by economic migration. Detective Morrison's reports documented an investigation that had required her to develop expertise in the psychology of confidence crimes as well as the specific techniques that made elderly people vulnerable to fraud. Her work had revealed a criminal organization that was sophisticated in its understanding of human nature but operated through simple techniques that relied more on social manipulation than on complex technical skills. The confidence scheme had been led by Catherine Walsh, a woman who had developed a talent for gaining the trust of elderly people by presenting herself as someone who shared their concerns about economic security and social change. Her criminal organization had included accomplices who played various roles in elaborate scenarios, designed to convince victims that they could improve their financial situations by participating in investment opportunities that were actually designed to steal their savings. Detective Morrison's investigation had required her to study the techniques of social manipulation that made confidence crimes possible, areas of knowledge that were not typically part of police training, but had become essential to understanding certain types of criminal behavior. Her reports documented the psychological principles that the criminals had used and the social conditions that had made elderly people particularly vulnerable to their approaches. The breakthrough in the case had come through Detective Morrison's patient analysis of the stories that multiple victims had told about their interactions with the confidence criminals. Her careful comparison of these accounts had revealed inconsistencies and patterns that suggested the crimes were being committed by a coordinated group rather than by isolated individuals, leading to an investigation that eventually uncovered the entire criminal organization. Catherine Walsh's confession had revealed a woman who had been motivated by her own financial desperation during the Great Depression, but who had developed increasingly sophisticated criminal techniques as her initial successes had led to more ambitious schemes. Her explanation of the confidence method she had used became a valuable resource for training police officers to recognize and investigate similar crimes. The case had concluded with the prosecution of the confidence ring and the partial recovery of funds that had been stolen from elderly victims, though Detective Morrison's final report had noted that the psychological damage inflicted by the crimes was often more significant than the financial losses. Her investigation had become a study in the way economic hardship could create both criminal opportunity and criminal motivation while also generating new forms of social vulnerability. The fluorescent lights above continued their steady hum as Detective Harper worked deeper into the night, surrounded by cabinets that contained the accumulated memory of decades of police work. Each file was a window into a different era of criminal behavior and law enforcement response, revealing the way social conditions had shaped both crime and investigation throughout the city's history. The archive would continue its patient work of preservation long after Detective Harper returned to the upper floors of the building, maintaining the conditions that kept these historical records safe for future investigators who might need to understand how crimes had been committed and solved in earlier eras. The stories contained in the basement files would wait quietly for readers who could appreciate both their practical value as police documentation and their inadvertent contribution to the social history of the community they served. In the deepest cabinets where dust gathered like snow on forgotten seasons, the oldest files would continue to whisper their stories to anyone with the patience to listen, preserving the memory of human behavior and official response through decades of social change, one carefully documented case at a time. In the basement archives where the city kept its longest memories, safe beneath layers of accumulated silence. Asterisk. The courthouse on 5th Street had been built in 1923, its limestone facade carved with figures representing justice, truth, and temperance that gazed down upon the sidewalk with the solemn authority of classical sculpture. Detective Michael Torres had discovered that the building's basement contained storage rooms filled with physical evidence from cases that predated the electronic cataloging systems that had transformed modern police work. These rooms, accessible through corridors that branched off from the main courthouse basement, held wooden boxes and metal containers that bore evidence, tags written in fountain pen ink that had faded to brown over the decades. The first storage room he explored contained evidence from cases tried in the 1950s and 60s, each container carefully labeled with case numbers, dates, and brief descriptions of contents written in the precise script of court clerks, who understood that their documentation might be needed years or even decades after the trials had concluded. The air in the room was dry and still, maintained by the same climate control system that preserved the court records upstairs, creating an environment where fabric, paper, and metal could survive the passage of time with minimal deterioration. Box number 1947CO034 contained evidence from a breaking and entering case that had been tried in Judge Morrison's courtroom during the autumn of that year. The case had involved the theft of jewelry from the home of Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a widow who lived in one of the city's most established neighborhoods where crime was rare enough to warrant extensive investigation and community attention. Detective Torres lifted the box's heavy wooden lid to reveal items, wrapped in brown paper and tagged with descriptions written in careful longhand. The stolen jewelry had been recovered and returned to Mrs. Patterson after the trial, but the evidence box contained photographs that documented both the crime scene and the recovered items with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized court proceedings of that era. The photographs were black and white prints mounted on heavy cardboard, each one labeled with the photographer's stamp and the date of documentation. They showed Mrs. Patterson's bedroom exactly as it had been found after the burglary, with drawers pulled open and the contents of her jewelry box scattered across the surface of her dressing table. The investigating officer had been Detective James Sullivan, whose case file was stored in the courthouse's legal archives 3 floors above. Detective Torres had spent the previous evening reading Detective Sullivan's reports, learning about an investigation that had required weeks of patient work to identify and apprehend the burglar. The crime had been solved not through dramatic detective work, but through the methodical process of canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing potential witnesses, and gradually building a picture of who had been present in the area on the day of the theft. The burglar had been identified as Robert Chun, a 19-year-old man who lived several neighborhoods away but who had been employed part-time by a landscaping company that maintained the gardens of homes in Mrs. Patterson's area. Detective Sullivan's investigation had revealed that Robert Chun had used his legitimate access to the neighborhood to study the routines of residents and identify homes that would be empty during predictable hours when burglaries could be committed without risk of confrontation. The evidence box contained Robert Chun's signed confession, written in his own handwriting on lined paper that bore the letterhead of the city attorney's office. The confession described not just the details of Mrs. Patterson's burglary, but also 3 other break-ins that Robert Chun had committed in the same neighborhood over the previous 2 months. His handwriting was careful and legible, suggesting someone who had taken time to think about what he was writing and who understood the permanent consequences of his admissions. Robert Chun had explained that he had begun the burglaries not from financial desperation, but from curiosity about how wealthy people lived. His work as a landscaper had given him glimpses into homes where the furniture, artwork, and personal possessions represented a level of affluence that was foreign to his own experience. The burglaries had started as exploration, with theft becoming a secondary consideration that eventually took precedence as he realized the financial value of what he was observing. The case had been tried in Judge Morrison's courtroom during a period when the city's courts operated with the unhurried thoroughness that characterized legal proceedings before crowded dockets and plea bargaining had transformed the administration of justice. The trial transcript, stored in the legal archives upstairs, documented 3 days of testimony that included not just the evidence against Robert Chun, but also character witnesses who spoke about his family circumstances and the social pressures that had contributed to his criminal behavior. Judge Morrison had sentenced Robert Chun to 18 months in the county jail, followed by 2 years of probation. But the case file also contained correspondence between the judge and social workers who had been assigned to help Robert Chun find legitimate employment that would use his skills, while keeping him away from the neighborhoods where he had committed his crimes. The letters revealed a judicial system that had time and resources to consider individual circumstances rather than simply processing cases according to standardized procedures. Detective Torres closed the evidence box and selected another container. From the same era, this one containing materials related to a fraud case that had been prosecuted in 1952. The case had involved the sale of worthless stock certificates to working-class families who had been led to believe they were investing in a company that would provide secure returns on their modest savings. The evidence box contained the fraudulent certificates themselves, printed on expensive paper with ornate borders and official-looking seals that had been designed to suggest legitimacy and financial stability. The fraud had been perpetrated by Marcus Thompson, a traveling salesman who had developed a sophisticated understanding of how to identify and exploit the financial anxieties of families who were struggling to achieve economic security during the uncertain economic conditions that followed World War II. Detective Raymond Foster had investigated the case with the methodical approach that characterized financial crime investigation before the development of electronic databases and interstate communication systems that would later make such crimes easier to detect and prosecute. The confession statements contained in the evidence box revealed men who had been driven to crime not by criminal inclinations but by economic circumstances that had left them with no legal means of supporting themselves or their families. Thomas Chung's statement described months of fruitless job searching that had exhausted his savings and threatened his family with eviction from their home. Robert Morrison had been unable to find work that would support his pregnant wife and 2 young children. James Walsh had watched his father lose the small business that had supported their extended family for 2 generations. The trial had been conducted during a period when judges and juries were deeply aware of the economic conditions that had created widespread unemployment and financial desperation. The prosecution had argued that economic hardship could not excuse criminal behavior, while the defense had maintained that the men's actions were understandable responses to circumstances that threatened their family's survival. The jury had found all 3 men guilty, but had recommended mercy based on their finding that the crime had been motivated by desperation rather than greed. Judge Morrison had sentenced each man to 5 years in state prison, but had also written a letter to the governor requesting that their sentences be reviewed in light of their exemplary behavior during incarceration and their families' continued need for support. The case file contained correspondence that documented the judge's ongoing concern for the welfare of both the criminals and their victims, reflecting a judicial system that had time and resources to consider individual circumstances rather than simply applying standardized penalties. The basement storage rooms seemed to extend endlessly beneath the courthouse, each chamber containing evidence from different periods of the city's history and creating an underground archive of criminal justice that paralleled the legal records maintained in the floors above. Detective Torres realized that he was exploring not just storage space, but a repository of human experience that documented the way crime and punishment had evolved through decades of social, economic, and technological change. Evidence Box 1929 B0203 contained materials related to a confidence scheme that had operated during the months before the stock market crash that triggered the Great Depression. The scheme had involved the sale of worthless land to families who had been led to believe they were purchasing lots in a development that would become a prosperous suburban community. The evidence box contained maps, photographs, and promotional materials that revealed the sophisticated planning that had made the fraud possible and the human cost that had made it criminal. The confidence scheme had been perpetrated by Harold Patterson, a former real estate salesman who had developed an understanding of how to exploit people's desire for economic advancement and social mobility during the prosperous years of the late 1920s. Detective Helen Foster had investigated the case with the limited resources that were available before the development of modern communication and transportation systems that would later make such investigations more efficient and comprehensive. Harold Patterson's criminal method had involved purchasing worthless land in remote areas and then creating elaborate promotional campaigns that suggested the land was located in areas that were scheduled for development as suburban communities. His promotional materials had included professional maps, architectural drawings, and photographs that created the impression of legitimate business planning while actually documenting entirely fictional development projects. Detective Foster's investigation had required her to travel to multiple locations where Harold Patterson had claimed his developments were taking place, documenting the actual conditions at these sites and proving that the promotional materials bore no relationship to reality. Her case file contained photographs that showed empty fields, swampland, and rocky terrain where Patterson had claimed roads, utilities, and community facilities were either already built or under construction. The victims of the confidence scheme had been working-class families who had saved money for years with the dream of escaping crowded urban neighborhoods and establishing homes in suburban communities where their children could grow up with access to clean air, good schools, and the social advantages that home ownership was supposed to provide. Their statements, contained in the evidence box, revealed people who had lost not just money, but also their faith in the American dream of economic advancement through hard work and careful planning. Harold Patterson's trial had taken place just weeks before the stock market crash that would transform the economic conditions that had made his confidence scheme possible. The trial transcript documented a legal proceeding that occurred during the final days of an era when most people believed that economic prosperity was permanent and that anyone who worked hard and made good decisions could achieve financial security and social advancement. Judge Sullivan had sentenced Harold Patterson to 7 years in state prison and had ordered him to make restitution to his victims, though the case file noted that most of the money had been spent on the promotional materials and travel expenses that had made the confidence scheme possible. The sentence had been considered appropriate for a crime that had exploited people's legitimate aspirations and had caused Financial hardship that would be compounded by the economic disaster that was already beginning to affect the national economy. The courthouse basement preserved these records with the same careful attention that was given to more recent evidence, maintaining storage conditions that would allow future researchers and investigators to study the evolution of crime and justice through periods of dramatic social change. Detective Torres realized that the basement storage rooms contained not just evidence from individual cases, but a comprehensive record of how human behavior and institutional response had adapted to changing circumstances over nearly a century of urban development. As the night approached its deepest hour, Detective Torres continued through the basement chambers, discovering evidence boxes that documented crimes and investigations from the earliest years of the courthouse's operation. Each container told a story not just about individual criminal behavior, but about the social conditions that had shaped both crime and law enforcement during different periods of the city's history. The courthouse would continue its patient work of preservation long after Detective Torres returned to the upper floors, maintaining the storage conditions that kept these historical records safe for future investigators who might need to understand how justice had been administered during earlier eras. The evidence boxes would wait quietly in their climate-controlled chambers, preserving the physical remnants of human drama and institutional response through decades of social change, one carefully documented case at a time. The courthouse stood like a monument to patience, its empty halls echoing with the weight of decisions that had shaped lives long after the voices that spoke them had fallen silent. Holding its secrets in basement chambers where evidence waited in wooden boxes and metal containers, preserved against time by the steady dedication of a system that understood the importance of maintaining connections between past and present, one case at a time. In the underground archives where justice kept its longest memories, the residential case, files filled an entire section of the basement archive, their manila folders thick with supplementary reports that documented not just criminal acts but the social fabric that surrounded them. Detective Susan Martinez had discovered these community-focused files during her fourth night in the archives, drawn to folders that bore notations like neighborhood impact assessment and family services coordination in the careful script of social workers and community liaisons who had understood that crime affected far more people than just its immediate victims and perpetrators. These files revealed a different approach to police work, one that had been practiced during the 1960s and 70s when urban departments had experimented with community-based law enforcement strategies that considered crime within the broader context of neighborhood life and family relationships. The reports were longer and more detailed than standard police documentation, written by officers who had been trained to understand social dynamics as well as criminal law, creating records that read like anthropological studies of community response to criminal behavior. The first file Detective Martinez selected contained reports related to a domestic violence case that had occurred in the Maple Street neighborhood during the summer of 1967. The case had involved recurring incidents at the Morrison household, where neighbors had repeatedly called police to report shouting, sounds of physical altercation, and requests for help that came through windows open to the warm night air. Officer Patricia Chun had been the responding officer, and her reports reflected the complexity of family violence during an era when legal remedies were limited and social services were primitive by modern standards. Officer Chun's initial report documented her first visit to the Morrison house on a Tuesday evening in June, when neighbors had called to report sounds of a violent argument that had escalated beyond the usual level of domestic discord. She had found Margaret Morrison with visible injuries that she attributed to falling down the basement stairs, while her husband Thomas Morrison had explained that his wife's clumsiness was exacerbated by her tendency to drink too much during hot weather. When the stress of caring for 3 young children became overwhelming, The report revealed Officer Chun's understanding that domestic violence cases required more than simple law enforcement responses. She had documented not just the immediate evidence of violence, but also the family's economic circumstances. Not just the immediate evidence of violence, but also the family's evidence of violence, but also the family's economic circumstances, ages and apparent welfare of the children, and the social support systems that might be available to help Margaret Morrison if she chose to leave her violent marriage. The officer's observations extended to details about the neighborhood itself, the proximity of other families who might provide assistance, the availability of public transportation that could help an abuse victim escape, and the informal networks of mutual aid that characterized working-class communities. Officer Chun's subsequent reports documented her growing relationship with the Morrison family over several months of repeated calls to their address. Each incident had been carefully documented not just as a criminal matter, but as a chapter in an ongoing family crisis that affected everyone in the household as well as neighbors, who were forced to witness violence that they felt powerless to prevent. The officer's reports revealed her patient efforts to build trust with Margaret Morrison, while also documenting evidence that could be used in court if Margaret ever decided to press charges against her husband. The breakthrough in the case had come not through dramatic police intervention, but through the slow development of trust between Officer Chen and Margaret Morrison. The officer's reports documented conversations that had taken place over several months, during which Margaret had gradually revealed the extent of her husband's violence and her own fear that leaving might result in even worse violence directed against her children. Officer Chun had connected Margaret with social services and legal aid organizations that had been newly created to assist domestic violence victims. The case file contained extensive documentation of the community response to the Morrison family situation. Officer Chun had interviewed neighbors who had struggled with the decision about whether to intervene directly or limit themselves to calling police when violence became audible from outside the house. Their statements revealed people who felt caught between the desire to help and the understanding that domestic violence was considered a private, family matter that outsiders were expected to avoid. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, who lived in the house directly next to the Morrisons, had provided a statement that captured the moral complexity of witnessing domestic violence in close-knit neighborhoods. She had known Margaret Morrison since childhood and had watched her marry Thomas Morrison with hopes for happiness that had gradually been replaced by fear and isolation. Mrs. Walsh's statement described her own internal struggle between respecting family privacy and responding to obvious suffering, a conflict that was shared by other neighbors who had similar relationships with the family. The resolution of the case had involved Margaret Morrison's decision to leave her husband and seek protection through the court system. But Officer Chun's reports documented the extensive community support that had made this decision possible. Neighbors had provided temporary housing, financial assistance, and childcare that allowed Margaret to attend court proceedings and meet with social workers. The case had become a study in the way communities could respond to domestic violence when formal institutions provided coordination and support. Thomas Morrison's arrest and prosecution had been documented with attention to the impact on his children as well as his wife. Officer Chun's reports noted that the 3 Morrison children had been traumatized not just by witnessing violence, but by the disruption of their family life when their father was removed from the home. The case file contained correspondence with school counselors, pediatricians, and social workers who had worked to help the children understand and recover from their exposure to domestic violence. The case had concluded with Thomas Morrison's conviction for assault and his sentence to domestic violence counseling and probation rather than imprisonment, a decision that had been made with consideration for his family's economic needs as well as the requirements of justice. Officer Chun's final report had noted that the case illustrated both the possibilities and limitations of community-based responses to family violence, demonstrating how neighbors and institutions could work together while also revealing the Ongoing challenges of protecting vulnerable family members. Detective Martinez set the Morrison file aside and selected another folder from the same neighborhood, this one containing reports related to a juvenile delinquency case that had involved several families and had revealed the complex social dynamics that shaped adolescent behavior in working-class communities. The case had been investigated by Detective Robert Foster, whose reports reflected the department's experimental approach to youth crime that emphasized family intervention and community involvement rather than purely punitive responses. The case had begun with a series of vandalism incidents at Lincoln Elementary School, where windows had been broken, graffiti had been painted on walls, and playground equipment had been damaged during weekend hours when the building was unoccupied. Detective Foster's investigation had revealed that the vandalism was being committed by a group of boys from the surrounding neighborhood who were expressing their frustration with school policies that they perceived as unfairly restrictive and socially divisive. The boys involved in the vandalism were between the ages of 12 and 15, and Detective Foster's reports documented their family circumstances with the thoroughness of a social worker conducting home studies. Michael Chung lived with his grandmother after his parents had been killed in an automobile accident 2 years earlier. Robert Morrison was the oldest of 6 children in a family where the father worked double shifts to support his large household, and the mother was overwhelmed by domestic responsibilities. James Walsh had been held back twice in school and was significantly older than his classmates, creating social isolation that contributed to his association with boys who were also struggling academically. Detective Foster's investigation had revealed that the vandalism was not random destruction, but a form of communication from boys who felt excluded from the academic culture that the school promoted. The graffiti, when analyzed carefully, contained messages that criticized the school's emphasis on college preparation while providing limited support for students who were struggling with basic academic skills. The property damage had been concentrated on symbols of academic achievement like trophy cases and bulletin boards that displayed honor roll students. The breakthrough in the case had come when Detective Foster realized that the boys' criminal behavior was connected to their experience of social marginalization within the school environment. His reports documented conversations with teachers, administrators, and parents that revealed a school culture that celebrated certain kinds of achievement while providing little recognition or support for students who excelled in other areas or who needed additional help to master basic academic skills. Detective Foster's approach to resolving the case had emphasized community involvement and family intervention rather than formal prosecution. His reports documented meetings with parents, school officials, and community leaders that had resulted in changes to school policies and the creation of alternative programs for students who were not succeeding in traditional academic settings. The boys who had committed the vandalism were required to repair the damage they had caused, but they were also given opportunities to contribute to school programs in ways that recognized their talents and interests. The case file contained extensive documentation of the community's response to the juvenile delinquency problem. Parents had organized committees to provide after-school supervision and recreational activities for boys who might otherwise be unsupervised during hours when vandalism typically occurred. Local businesses had created part-time employment opportunities that gave older boys legitimate ways to earn money while learning job skills that would be valuable, whether they continued their education or entered the workforce after graduation. The resolution of the vandalism case had involved changes that extended far beyond the individual boys who had committed the crimes. Detective Foster's final report noted that the case had revealed systemic problems in the way the school system served working-class families and had led to reforms that benefited many students who had not been involved in criminal behavior, but who had been struggling with similar feelings of exclusion and academic inadequacy. Detective Martinez found herself drawn deeper into the community-focused files. discovering cases that revealed the intricate connections between individual criminal behavior and the social conditions that shaped family and neighborhood life. These reports were written by officers who had been trained to understand crime as a social phenomenon rather than simply individual moral failing, creating documentation that read like sociology texts disguised as police reports. A thick folder from 1971 contained Detective William Thompson's investigation of a drug dealing case that had involved multiple families in the Oak Street neighborhood and had required intervention strategies that addressed economic as well as criminal issues. The case had begun with complaints from parents about drug sales near the elementary school, but Detective Thompson's investigation had revealed a complex network of economic relationships that connected drug dealing to the limited employment opportunities available to young men in the neighborhood. The drug dealing had been organized by Marcus Patterson, a 23-year-old man who had been unable to find steady employment since graduating from high school 5 years earlier. Detective Thompson's reports documented Marcus's family circumstances, with attention to the economic pressures that had contributed to his involvement in illegal activities. His father had been disabled in an industrial accident and was receiving workers' compensation that was insufficient to support the family's needs. His mother worked part-time as a domestic worker, but her income was irregular and inadequate to cover the household's basic expenses. Marcus Patterson had recruited other young men from the neighborhood who were facing similar economic pressures. Detective Thompson's investigation revealed that most of the drug dealers were supporting not just themselves but also family members who were unemployed, disabled, or working in low-paying jobs that did not provide sufficient income for basic needs. The drug dealing network had become an informal economic system that provided income to families who had been excluded from legitimate employment opportunities. Detective Thompson's approach to the case had emphasized understanding the social and economic conditions that made drug dealing attractive to young men who might otherwise have chosen legitimate employment. His reports documented conversations with community leaders, social workers, and employment counselors who provided context for the criminal behavior while also identifying resources that might offer alternatives to illegal income generation. The breakthrough in the case had come when Detective Thompson realized that effective intervention required addressing the economic needs that motivated drug dealing as well as the criminal behavior itself. His reports documented coordination with job training programs, community colleges, and local employers who were willing to provide employment opportunities for young men who were committed to leaving illegal activities behind. Marcus Patterson's arrest and prosecution had been accompanied by extensive community intervention designed to address the underlying problems that had made drug dealing seem like a reasonable economic choice. Detective Thompson's reports documented the creation of job training programs, educational opportunities, and family support services that were designed to provide legitimate alternatives to drug dealing for young men who were struggling with unemployment and economic insecurity. The case had concluded with Marcus Patterson's conviction and sentence to probation rather than imprisonment, a decision that had been made with consideration for his family's economic needs and his commitment to participating in job training and community service programs. Detective Thompson's final report had noted that the case illustrated the importance of addressing social and economic conditions rather than simply prosecuting individual criminals when dealing with crime that emerged from systematic social problems. The community response to the drug dealing case had involved churches, community organizations, and local businesses in creating programs that provided support and opportunities for young people who were at risk of involvement in illegal activities. Detective Thompson's documentation of these efforts revealed a neighborhood that had mobilized its resources to address crime through community development rather than simply relying on law enforcement to arrest and prosecute offenders. Detective Martinez continued through the community files, discovering cases that revealed how crime affected entire neighborhoods and how Communities had developed both formal and informal responses to criminal behavior that threatened their social fabric. The reports were written during an era when police departments had experimented with community policing strategies that emphasized prevention and social intervention rather than purely reactive law enforcement. A folder from 1969 contained Detective Helen Rodriguez's investigation of a check kiting scheme that had involved several families in the Elm Street neighborhood and had revealed the complex financial strategies that working-class people had developed to manage economic insecurity during periods of inflation and wage stagnation. The case had begun with complaints from local merchants about customers who were writing checks that were being returned for insufficient funds. But Detective Rodriguez's investigation had revealed a sophisticated understanding of banking procedures that allowed families to temporarily access money they did not actually have. The check kiting scheme had been organized by Catherine Morrison, a 38-year-old mother of 4 who had developed expertise in banking procedures through her work as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. Detective Rodriguez's reports documented Catherine's family circumstances with attention to the economic pressures that had motivated her involvement in financial fraud. Her husband had been laid off from his factory job 6 months earlier and had been unable to find new employment that paid enough to support their family's needs. Catherine Morrison had taught other families in the neighborhood how to use multiple bank accounts to create the temporary appearance of having money that could be accessed through check writing even when their actual account balances were insufficient to cover the checks they were writing. Detective Rodriguez's investigation revealed that the scheme had allowed several families to pay rent, buy groceries, and meet other immediate needs during periods when unemployment benefits were inadequate to cover their basic expenses. The investigation had required Detective Rodriguez to develop expertise in banking procedures and check processing systems that allowed her to understand how the scheme worked and to identify the families who were participating in it. Her reports documented the technical aspects of check kiting with the thoroughness of someone who understood that effective prosecution required mastery of the financial systems that were being manipulated. The breakthrough in the case had come when Detective Rodriguez realized that the check kiting scheme was not motivated by greed, but by desperation, and that effective intervention required addressing the economic problems that had made financial fraud seem like a reasonable solution to legitimate family needs. Her reports documented coordination with social services, employment agencies, and community organizations that could provide assistance to families who were struggling with unemployment and economic insecurity. Catherine Morrison's arrest and prosecution had been accompanied by extensive family intervention designed to address the economic problems that had motivated her involvement in check kiting. Detective Rodriguez's reports documented the provision of emergency financial assistance, job placement services, and budget counseling that helped Catherine's family develop legitimate strategies for managing their economic challenges. The case had concluded with Catherine Morrison's conviction and sentence to community service and restitution rather than imprisonment, a decision that had been made with consideration for her children's needs and her family's economic circumstances. Detective Rodriguez's final report had noted that the case illustrated the way economic desperation could push law-abiding people toward criminal behavior and the importance of providing social services that addressed underlying problems rather than simply prosecuting individual criminals. The community response to the check kiting case had involved local banks, credit unions, and financial counseling services in creating programs that helped families manage economic crises without resorting to illegal financial strategies. Detective Rodriguez's documentation of these efforts revealed a neighborhood that had learned to address crime through community education and economic support rather than simply relying on law enforcement to arrest and prosecute offenders. The basement archive maintained its steady environment as Detective Martinez continued through the community files, each folder revealing another layer of the complex relationship between individual criminal behavior and the social conditions that shaped family and neighborhood life. The reports were written by officers who had understood that effective law enforcement required attention to social dynamics as well as criminal activity, creating documentation that served as both police records and community histories. A file from 1973 contained Detective James Sullivan's investigation of a burglary ring that had targeted homes in the Pine Street neighborhood and had revealed the way economic inequality had created both criminal opportunity and community vulnerability. The case had involved a series of break-ins at houses belonging to families who had achieved modest prosperity through steady employment and careful saving, making them attractive targets for criminals who understood the difference between conspicuous wealth and achievable theft. The burglary ring had been led by Robert Chun, a 25-year-old man who had grown up in the Pine Street neighborhood but who had been unable to achieve the same economic success as his childhood friends and neighbors. Detective Sullivan's reports documented Robert's family circumstances and personal history with attention to the social dynamics that had contributed to his criminal behavior. He had dropped out of high school to work and help support his family, but his lack of education had limited his employment opportunities to low-paying jobs that did not provide sufficient income for the kind of life he had observed among his more successful neighbors. Robert Chun had recruited accomplices who were also from the neighborhood and who had intimate knowledge of their targets' routines, security measures, and the location of valuable items that could be stolen and sold without attracting suspicion. Detective Sullivan's investigation revealed that the burglary ring had been motivated not just by financial need, but by resentment against neighbors who had achieved prosperity that seemed unattainable to people who had started from similar circumstances but had not been able to overcome the educational and economic barriers that limited their opportunities. The investigation had required Detective Sullivan to navigate the complex social dynamics of a neighborhood where criminals and victims knew each other personally and where the usual distinctions between law-abiding citizens and criminal offenders were complicated by shared history and ongoing relationships. His reports documented the way the burglaries had affected not just individual families, but the entire community's sense of security and trust. The breakthrough in the case had come when Detective Sullivan realized that solving the burglaries required understanding the social tensions that had motivated them as well as identifying the individuals who had committed them. His reports documented conversations with community leaders, social workers, and employment counselors who provided context for the criminal behavior, while also identifying resources that might address the underlying problems that had contributed to it. Robert Chun's arrest and prosecution had been accompanied by community intervention designed to address the social and economic conditions that had contributed to the burglary ring's formation. Detective Sullivan's reports documented efforts to create job training programs, educational opportunities, and conflict resolution services that could help prevent similar crimes, while also addressing the resentment and inequality that had motivated the Pecos original offenses. The case had concluded with Robert Chun's conviction and sentence to a combination of imprisonment and community service. But Detective Sullivan's final report had emphasized the community-based programs that had been created to address the underlying social problems that had contributed to the crime. The burglary case had become a catalyst for neighborhood discussions about economic inequality and the importance of creating opportunities for people who had been excluded from traditional paths to prosperity. As the night deepened toward dawn, Detective Martinez continued through the community files, discovering documentation of crimes that had affected entire neighborhoods and had required responses that involved families, churches, schools, and local businesses in collaborative efforts to address both criminal behavior and the social conditions that contributed to it. The files revealed an approach to law enforcement that had considered crime within the broader context of community life and had sought solutions that strengthened social bonds rather than simply removing offenders from the neighborhood. The archive would continue its patient work of preservation, maintaining these community-focused files as evidence of experimental approaches to law enforcement that had emphasized social intervention and community development rather than purely punitive responses to criminal behavior. The documentation would remain available for future researchers and practitioners who might want to understand how communities had mobilized their resources to address crime through collective action and mutual support. In the quiet neighborhoods where children played in front yards that had witnessed both laughter and sorrow, every house held stories that connected families across generations of joy and loss, creating webs of relationship that both criminal behavior and community response had to navigate with understanding of the human connections that bound people together in networks of shared experience and mutual responsibility. One carefully documented case at a time, the night shift began officially at 11 o'clock. But the real transition happened gradually over the course of an hour as the day officers completed their reports, turned over their cases to colleagues who would carry them through the quiet hours, and made their way home to families who had learned to time their dinners and conversations around the irregular schedules that police work demanded. Sergeant Elena Rodriguez had been working the night shift for 8 years, and she understood the rhythm that governed the station during the hours when most of the city slept, when emergency calls became less frequent and the work shifted toward the careful documentation and analysis that formed the foundation of effective law enforcement. Main desk in the station's lobby was staffed throughout the night by Officer Michael Chun, whose reports were written in the careful script of someone who understood that the night shift attracted a different kind of police business than the dramatic emergencies that characterized daytime operations. During the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, people came to the station with problems that had been accumulating for weeks or months, situations that required patient listening and careful documentation rather than immediate action and emergency response. Officer Chun's logbook from a typical Tuesday night in October documented the steady flow of citizens who brought their problems to the police station when the rest of the city was asleep. At 12:30, Mrs. Margaret Walsh had arrived to report that her neighbor's dog had been barking every night for 2 weeks, keeping her awake and making her daily work as a school custodian more difficult than her age and health could easily manage. Her complaint required not investigation but careful documentation that could be used to mediate between neighbors who were struggling with the kinds of conflicts that emerged when people lived in close proximity without clear understanding of their mutual responsibilities. Officer Chun's report on Mrs. Walsh's complaint revealed the patience that night shift officers developed for problems that were simultaneously trivial and important, issues that affected people's daily lives without rising to the level of criminal behavior. His documentation included not just the specific facts of the noise complaint, but also Mrs. Walsh's explanation of how lack of sleep was affecting her work performance and her health, creating a record that could be used by community mediators who specialized in resolving neighborhood disputes through conversation rather than legal action. At 1:15, Thomas Morrison had appeared at the desk to report that someone had been going through his trash cans during the night, leaving the contents scattered on the sidewalk and creating a mess that he had to clean up each morning before leaving for work. Officer Chun's report noted that Mr. Morrison was less concerned about the inconvenience than about the possibility that someone was searching for personal information that could be used for identity theft or other forms of fraud that had become more common as people began to understand the value of discarded documents and financial records the trash investigation required. Officer Chun to understand both the criminal possibilities that Mr. Morrison was worried about and the innocent explanations that might account for the scattered garbage. His report documented the location of Mr. Morrison's house, the timing of garbage collection in that neighborhood, and the possibility that animals were responsible for the disturbance rather than human intruders. The officer's approach reflected the night shift's emphasis on thorough documentation that could support further investigation if the situation escalated, while also providing reassurance to citizens who were concerned about problems that might not require criminal investigation. Detective Sarah Foster had been assigned to the night shift's investigative unit, where her primary responsibility was reviewing cases that had been opened during day shifts and required follow-up work that could be accomplished through telephone calls, document analysis, and computer database searches that didn't require direct contact with witnesses or suspects. Her office on the third floor of the station was lit by a single desk lamp that created a pool of warm light in the larger darkness of the building's administrative areas, where the fluorescent ceiling lights were turned off to save energy during hours when most of the staff was at home. Detective Foster's work during the night shift centered on a burglary case that had been opened 3 weeks earlier when Mrs. Catherine Patterson had returned from a week-long visit to her sister to find that someone had entered her house and stolen jewelry, electronics, and other valuable items while she was away. The investigating officer had documented the crime scene and interviewed neighbors during the initial investigation, but the case required follow-up work that involved checking pawn shop records, analyzing similar crimes in the area, and coordinating with other law enforcement agencies to track stolen items that might have been transported to other jurisdictions. The pawn shop records that Detective Foster reviewed during her night shift revealed a pattern of activity that suggested the burglary might have been committed by someone who understood how to convert stolen goods into cash without attracting suspicion. The stolen jewelry had been sold to 3 different pawn shops over the course of 2 weeks, with each transaction involving amounts that were small enough to avoid triggering reporting requirements that might have led to earlier detection of the theft. Detective Foster's analysis of the pawn shop transactions required her to understand both the legal requirements that governed second-hand dealers and the criminal techniques that allowed thieves to exploit weaknesses in the system. Her reports documented the specific details of each transaction, including descriptions of the person who had sold the jewelry, the prices paid, and the documentation that had been required to complete the sales. The pattern that emerged suggested someone who was experienced in converting stolen goods to cash and who understood how to minimize the risk of detection. The comparison of Mrs. Patterson's burglary with similar crimes in the area revealed connections that had not been apparent during the initial investigation. Detective Foster's database searches showed that 3 other houses in the same neighborhood had been burglarized during the previous month, each during periods when the residents were away from home for extended periods. The pattern suggested a criminal who was conducting surveillance to identify when houses would be empty and who was selecting targets based on their vulnerability rather than the value of their contents. Detective Foster's night shift work involved creating detailed charts that mapped the timing, location, and methods of the 4 related burglaries, looking for patterns that might help identify the person responsible and predict where future crimes might occur. Her analysis revealed that all 4 burglaries had taken place during weekdays when most neighbors would be at work, and that the criminal had gained entry through rear doors or windows that were not visible from the street. The methodical approach suggested someone who was planning each crime carefully rather than acting impulsively. Breakthrough in the case came when Detective Foster's analysis of the pawn shop records revealed that the same person had sold items from multiple burglaries, providing a connection that linked crimes that had initially been investigated as separate incidents. Her night shift documentation included detailed descriptions of the seller that had been provided by pawn shop employees, creating a composite picture that could be used to identify the person responsible for the series of burglaries. Officer James Thompson worked the night patrol, driving through neighborhoods where most houses were dark and most streets were empty except for the occasional late worker returning home or early worker beginning their day. His patrol reports documented the quiet observations that characterized night shift police work, the businesses that stayed open late and attracted customers who might create disturbances, the residential areas where domestic disputes occasionally erupted into public altercations, and the commercial districts where property crimes were most likely to occur during hours when natural surveillance was minimal. Officer Thompson's patrol of the downtown area during the early morning hours revealed the different character that the city took on when most of its population was asleep. The streets that bustled with activity during business hours became corridors of shadow and artificial light where every sound carried further, and every movement attracted attention from the few people who were awake to observe it. His reports documented the businesses that remained open throughout the night, the individuals who moved through the downtown area during the quiet hours, and the situations that required police attention during the city's most peaceful time. At 2:45, Officer Thompson had responded to a call about suspicious activity near the entrance to Morrison's department store, where someone had been observed testing door handles and examining window displays with what appeared to be more than casual interest. His investigation revealed Robert Chun, a 24-year-old man who explained that he was walking downtown because he couldn't sleep and was looking at store windows to pass time until the buses started running and he could return home to a neighborhood that was not within walking distance of the commercial district. Officer Thompson's report on the suspicious activity call revealed the complex judgments that night shift officers had to make about behavior that was unusual without being clearly criminal. Robert Chun's explanation was plausible, and his identification and address checked out when Officer Thompson called them into the dispatcher. But the late hour and the location near a commercial establishment required careful documentation in case the contact was related to future criminal activity in the area. The officers' approach to the situation reflected the night shift's emphasis on community contact and documentation, rather than immediate enforcement action. His report included not just the basic facts of the encounter, but also his assessment of Robert Chun's demeanor, his explanation for being in the area, and the circumstances that had led to the suspicious activity call. The documentation would be available for future reference if Robert Chun was involved in criminal activity, but it also served to reassure business owners that police were maintaining surveillance during vulnerable overnight hours. Detective William Rodriguez worked the night shift in the station's criminal investigations unit, where his primary responsibility was analyzing evidence and preparing reports for cases that were scheduled for court appearances during the following weeks. His work required the kind of detailed attention to legal requirements and procedural accuracy that was easier to accomplish during the quiet overnight hours when interruptions were minimal and concentration could be sustained for long periods without the distractions that characterized daytime police work. Detective Rodriguez's current project involved preparing testimony for a fraud case that had been under investigation for 6 months and was scheduled for trial in 2 weeks. The case involved a complex scheme in which Marcus Patterson had created false documentation to obtain credit cards, loans, and other financial services using identities that belonged to real people who were unaware that their personal information was being used for criminal purposes. The detective's night shift work involved organizing hundreds of documents, bank records, and witness statements into a coherent narrative that could be presented effectively in court. The fraud case required Detective Rodriguez to master financial systems and identity verification procedures that were constantly evolving as businesses attempted to balance customer convenience with security measures designed to prevent exactly the kind of crime that Marcus Patterson had committed. His preparation for testimony involved not just organizing evidence but also ensuring that he could explain complex financial procedures to a jury that would include people with varying levels of understanding about banking, credit, and identity verification systems. Detective Rodriguez's analysis of the evidence revealed the sophistication of Marcus Patterson's criminal scheme, which had involved obtaining personal information from multiple sources and using it to create false identities that were convincing enough to pass the security checks that financial institutions used to verify customer applications. The scheme had been successful for over a year before being detected, during which time Marcus Patterson had obtained thousands of dollars in credit and loans that he had no intention of repaying. Detective's night shift documentation included detailed timelines that showed how Marcus Patterson had built false identities gradually over several months, creating credit histories and establishing relationships with financial institutions before requesting larger amounts of credit that represented the real purpose of his criminal scheme. The pattern revealed a criminal who understood financial systems well enough to exploit their weaknesses while avoiding the kind of obvious fraud that would have been detected quickly by routine security measures. Asterisk. The evidence preparation required Detective Rodriguez to coordinate with investigators from other jurisdictions where Marcus Patterson had committed similar crimes, creating a comprehensive picture of criminal activity that had extended across state lines and had involved multiple victims whose identities had been stolen and misused. The detective's work involved not just organizing evidence for the local case, but also ensuring that information was shared effectively with other law enforcement agencies that were pursuing related prosecutions. Sergeant Elena Rodriguez supervised the night shift operations from her office on the second floor of the station, where she maintained radio contact with patrol officers and coordinated responses to the emergency calls that occasionally disrupted the quiet routine of overnight police work. Her responsibilities included not just immediate supervision of night shift personnel, but also long-term planning for investigations and community programs that required the kind of sustained attention that was possible during the less hectic overnight hours. Sergeant Rodriguez's night shift reports documented the station's activities during the quiet hours when most police work involved documentation, analysis, and preparation rather than emergency response and immediate action. Her logs showed the steady flow of administrative work that continued throughout the night, reports being typed and filed, evidence being processed and stored, and databases being updated with information that would be available to day shift officers when they returned to work in the morning. The sergeant's office contained files related to community policing initiatives that were being developed during the night shift when there was time for the kind of careful planning that was difficult to accomplish during the busier daytime hours. These programs involved coordination with schools, churches, and community organizations to address crime prevention through education and social intervention rather than simply responding to criminal activity after it had occurred. One of the community programs that Sergeant Rodriguez was developing involved working with local high schools to provide education about identity theft and financial fraud, areas of crime that were becoming more common as young people gained access to technology and financial services without necessarily understanding the risks they faced or the criminal opportunities they might encounter. The program required coordination with school administrators, parents, and community leaders who were concerned about protecting young people from both becoming victims of crime and being recruited into criminal activities. The night shift's work on community programs reflected the understanding that effective law enforcement required long-term prevention strategies as well as immediate responses to criminal behavior. Sergeant Rodriguez's documentation of these initiatives showed how police departments could use the quieter overnight hours to develop relationships and programs that would strengthen community safety through education and social intervention rather than relying solely on arrest and prosecution to address crime. The station's communication center operated throughout the night with a reduced staff that handled the emergency calls and routine communications that connected patrol officers with the resources they needed to respond effectively to the situations they encountered. Dispatcher Catherine Morrison worked alone during the overnight hours, maintaining radio contact with patrol officers and coordinating with other emergency services when situations required fire department or ambulance response in addition to police intervention. Dispatcher Morrison's logs documented the rhythm of night shift communications, which were characterized by longer periods of routine radio traffic, interrupted by occasional emergency calls that required immediate coordination of multiple resources. Her work involved not just relaying information, but also serving as a communication hub that connected patrol officers with detective units, supervisory personnel, and other law enforcement agencies when situations required coordination beyond what individual officers could accomplish independently. The dispatcher's overnight logs showed the variety of situations that required police response during the quiet hours, when most of the city was asleep. Domestic disturbances, suspicious activity calls, and minor traffic accidents were the most common types of incidents. But the night shift also handled occasional serious crimes that required the same rapid response and resource coordination that characterized daytime emergency operations. At 4:15, Dispatcher Morrison had coordinated the response to a burglary in progress call that required multiple patrol units and detective support to apprehend suspects who were still at the scene when police arrived. Her communications logs documented the careful coordination that ensured officers approached the scene safely, while also preventing the suspects from escaping before they could be arrested and the stolen property could be recovered. The burglary in progress call revealed the importance of maintaining full law enforcement capabilities during overnight hours when criminal activity might be more difficult to detect, but was equally serious in its impact on victims and community safety. Dispatcher Morrison's coordination of the response ensured that night shift personnel could respond as effectively as their daytime counterparts to situations that required immediate action and careful tactical planning. As dawn approached and the night shift prepared to turn over their responsibilities to the day officers who would soon arrive to begin another cycle of police work, the station maintained the steady rhythm of documentation and analysis that continued regardless of the hour or the day of the week. The night shift's work would be preserved in reports, logs, and databases that would be available to support ongoing investigations and community programs long after the officers who had created them had returned home to rest before beginning another night of quiet service to the sleeping city. The clock on the station wall continued its steady pulse, marking time with the same mechanical precision that governed all the building's operations, synchronized with the breathing of an institution that never truly slept, but only shifted into the quieter rhythms of night, where paperwork was completed in pools of lamplight and crimes were remembered not for their drama, but for their presence on pages that would outlive the shifts that created them. One carefully documented hour at a time, The photography archive occupied a climate-controlled room adjacent to the main evidence storage, its metal filing cabinets containing thousands of crime scene photographs that documented decades of police work with the mechanical precision of cameras that had captured moments of human drama and transformed them into evidence that could be analyzed, filed, and preserved long after the emotions they had recorded had faded into memory. Detective Anna Chun had discovered this photographic repository during her 5th night in the basement archives, drawn by file cabinets labeled with photographers' names and decades that stretched back to the earliest days of police photography in the city. The photographs from the 1930s were mounted on heavy cardboard backing and stored in envelopes that bore the careful notation of evidence clerks, who had understood that visual documentation would become increasingly important as court proceedings required more precise evidence than witness testimony alone could provide. The earliest crime scene photographs had been taken with large format cameras that required careful setup and precise exposure calculations, creating images that possessed a formal quality that made even the most dramatic scenes appear composed and deliberate. Detective Chen selected an envelope marked Case 1936H0089, Morrison Manufacturing Fire, and found herself examining photographs that documented an industrial fire that had claimed 3 lives and destroyed a factory that had employed over 200 workers during the depth of the Great Depression. The photographs showed the aftermath of the blaze with the stark clarity that characterized early police photography, each image carefully composed to document specific aspects of the scene that investigators had considered significant to their determination of whether the fire had been accidental or deliberately set. The fire had occurred during the early morning hours of a Tuesday in November, when the factory should have been empty except for a night watchman who had been found dead in his office, apparently overcome by smoke before he could escape the burning building. The photographs documented not just the physical damage caused by the fire, but also the industrial equipment, raw materials, and finished products that had been destroyed, creating a visual inventory of the economic impact that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of the deaths. Detective Thomas Sullivan had investigated the fire with the methodical approach that characterized arson investigation before the development of modern forensic techniques, relying on careful observation of burn patterns, interviews with witnesses, and analysis of the factory's financial records to determine whether someone had deliberately set the fire for economic gain. The photographs he had commissioned showed the fire's point of origin, the patterns of damage that indicated how the flames had spread, and the locations where the 3 victims had been found. The investigation had revealed that Morrison Manufacturing had been struggling financially for over a year, with declining orders and mounting debts that threatened the company's survival during a period when many similar businesses were failing due to reduced demand for manufactured goods. The photographs included images of the company's financial records, which had been partially damaged by the fire, but had been preserved well enough to document the economic pressures that provided a potential motive for arson. The breakthrough in the case had come when Detective Sullivan's analysis of the burn patterns revealed that the fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously, a pattern that was inconsistent with accidental ignition but suggested the deliberate use of accelerants to ensure rapid spread of the flames. The photographs documented the specific locations where the fire had begun and the evidence of chemical accelerants that had been used to make the blaze more destructive than a natural fire would have been. The arrest of Harold Morrison, the factory owner, had been based on evidence that included not just the arson investigation but also documentation of his financial desperation and his access to the building during the hours when the fire had been set. The photographs preserved in the case file included images of Harold Morrison's arrest, showing a man whose expression revealed the weight of decisions that had led to tragedy far beyond what he had intended when he had chosen to destroy his failing business for insurance money. Harold Morrison's confession, documented in Detective Sullivan's careful handwriting, had revealed that the fire had been intended to destroy only property and equipment, with the timing planned to ensure that no one would be present in the building when the blaze occurred. The death of the night watchman and 2 homeless men who had been sheltering in the building, without Harold Morrison's knowledge, had transformed a property crime into a triple murder that carried far more serious legal and moral consequences than the perpetrator had anticipated. The trial photographs documented the legal proceedings that had resulted in Harold Morrison's conviction for arson and involuntary manslaughter, showing a courtroom filled with family members of the victims and former employees whose livelihoods had been destroyed along with the factory. The formal court photography of that era had captured not just the legal procedures, but also the human cost of crimes that had economic motivations, but tragic consequences that extended far beyond financial considerations. Detective Chen set the Morrison manufacturing photographs aside and selected another envelope from the same decade, this one containing images from a kidnapping case that had captured public attention during the summer of 1937. The photographs documented the investigation of 8-year-old Mary Patterson's disappearance from a playground, where she had been playing with friends during the afternoon hours, when such crimes were considered virtually impossible in neighborhoods where community surveillance was informal but effective. Detective Robert Foster had led the kidnapping investigation with the comprehensive approach that serious crimes against children demanded during an era when such cases were rare enough to warrant extensive resources and community mobilization. The photographs he had commissioned documented not just the crime scene, but also the broader social context that surrounded Mary Patterson's disappearance, including images of the neighborhood, the playground, and the family circumstances that provided background for understanding the case. The kidnapping had been committed by Margaret Walsh, a 42-year-old woman who had lost her own daughter to pneumonia 2 years earlier and had become increasingly obsessed with the idea of replacing her lost child with another girl who reminded her of what her daughter might have become. Detective Foster's investigation had revealed a woman whose grief had evolved into mental illness that expressed itself through the belief that taking Mary Patterson would somehow restore the family life that her daughter's death had destroyed. The photographs of Mary Patterson's rescue showed a child who had been well cared for during her week-long captivity, but who had been confused and frightened by the experience of being separated from her family and forced to live with a woman who insisted on calling her by her dead daughter's name. The images captured both the relief of successful resolution and the psychological complexity of a crime that had been motivated by loss rather than malice. Margaret Walsh's arrest photographs revealed a woman whose mental state was clearly disturbed, but who had committed her crime with careful planning that suggested she understood the difference between right and wrong, even as her grief-driven obsession had led her to choose wrong. Detective Foster's investigation had documented the gradual deterioration of Margaret Walsh's mental health following her daughter's death, and her increasing focus on Mary Patterson as a potential replacement for what she had lost. The case had concluded with Margaret Walsh's commitment to a state mental hospital rather than imprisonment, a decision that reflected the legal system's understanding that her crime had been motivated by mental illness rather than criminal intent. The photographs preserved in the case file documented not just the investigation and resolution, but also the community's response to a crime that had challenged simple categories of guilt and innocence. The photography archive contained images from hundreds of cases that had been investigated during the decades before television news and electronic media had made crime scene photography a regular part of public discourse about criminal justice. Detective Chun found herself drawn to photographs that captured moments of human drama that had been preserved with the formal dignity that characterized official documentation. During earlier eras of police work, a collection of photographs from 1941 documented a murder case that had shocked the community during the months when the nation was adjusting to the realities of World War II and the social changes that military mobilization had brought to civilian life. The case had involved the death of James Morrison, a defense plant worker who had been found beaten to death in an alley behind the factory, where he worked the night shift producing materials for the war effort. Detective Helen Rodriguez had investigated the murder with attention to the social tensions that had emerged as the city's population had grown rapidly with the arrival of workers who had come to take jobs in defense plants that offered higher wages than most people had ever earned, but also created competition for housing, services, and social recognition that had not existed before the war. The photographs she had commissioned documented not just the crime scene, but also the industrial environment that had created new forms of community stress and conflict. The investigation had revealed that James Morrison had been killed during a fight that had started as an argument about work assignments and overtime opportunities, but had escalated into violence when personal animosities had been inflamed by alcohol and the social tensions that characterized communities where people from different backgrounds were thrown together by economic opportunity and wartime necessity. The photograph showed the alley where the fight had occurred and the industrial environment that had created the social conditions that made such conflicts more likely. The murder had been committed by Robert Chun, a 26-year-old man who had come to the city from a rural area to work in the defense plants and who had struggled to adapt to urban life and industrial work schedules that were foreign to his previous experience. Detective Rodriguez's investigation had revealed the social isolation and cultural displacement that had contributed to his involvement in the fight that had resulted in James Morrison's death. Robert Chun's confession had described a man who had been overwhelmed by the changes that wartime mobilization had brought to his life and who had responded to stress and confusion with violence that had tragic consequences he had not intended. The photographs preserved in the case file documented both the immediate evidence of the crime and the broader social context that had made such tragedies more likely during a period of rapid social change. The trial photograph showed a courtroom where the normal procedures of criminal justice had been complicated by wartime concerns about maintaining morale and productivity in defense plants that were essential to the war effort. Robert Chun's conviction for manslaughter rather than murder had reflected the jury's understanding that his crime had been the result of circumstances beyond his control rather than premeditated malice. Detective Chun continued through the photography archive, discovering images that documented the evolution of both criminal behavior and investigative techniques through decades of social change. The photographs from earlier eras possessed a formal quality that reflected the time and equipment required to create them, but they also captured human moments with an honesty that was sometimes more revealing than the careful prose of official reports. A series of photographs from 1944 documented a black market operation that had involved the illegal sale of ration goods during the final years of World War II, when shortages of consumer products had created opportunities for criminals who could provide forbidden merchandise to people who were willing to pay premium prices for items they could not obtain through legal channels. The photograph showed warehouses filled with stockpiled goods, documents that revealed the extent of the illegal operation, and the arrest of participants who had risked prosecution to participate in commerce that violated wartime regulations. Detective William Thompson had investigated the black market operation with understanding of both the legal requirements that made such commerce illegal and the social pressures that made it attractive to people who were struggling with wartime restrictions that limited their access to goods they considered essential to maintaining normal family life. The photographs he had commissioned documented not just the criminal evidence, but also the social context that had created demand for illegal goods and services. The black market operation had been led by Thomas Patterson, a wholesale distributor who had used his legitimate business connections to obtain rationed goods in quantities that exceeded what legal distribution channels allowed, then sold the excess through networks that connected producers with consumers who were willing to pay black market prices. The photograph showed the sophisticated organization that had made the operation successful for over 2 years before being detected by federal investigators. Thomas Patterson's arrest photographs revealed a man who had been motivated more by patriotic resentment against government regulations than by simple profit. Someone who believed that rationing restrictions violated American principles of free enterprise and individual choice. His involvement in black market commerce had been his way of expressing political opposition to wartime controls that he considered excessive and harmful to civilian morale. The case had been prosecuted by federal authorities because violations of rationing regulations were considered crimes against the war effort rather than simple commercial violations. But the photographs preserved in the local police files documented the community impact of black market operations that had provided goods and services that people wanted but could not obtain legally. The photography archive's climate control system maintained constant temperature and humidity, levels that preserved the chemical composition of photographic materials that would otherwise deteriorate rapidly in normal storage conditions. Detective Chun realized that she was viewing images that had been preserved with the same care that museums used to protect historical documents, creating a visual record of criminal justice that complemented the written documentation contained in the case files. A collection of photographs from 1949 documented a confidence scheme that had targeted elderly residents who had been approached by criminals claiming to represent investment opportunities that would provide secure income during retirement, years when Social Security benefits were minimal and private pension plans were rare. The photograph showed the elaborate materials that had been used to create the impression of legitimate business operations, including false credentials, promotional brochures, and office spaces that had been rented temporarily to provide settings for meetings with potential victims. Detective Maria Santos had investigated the confidence scheme with attention to both the criminal techniques that made such frauds possible and the social vulnerabilities that made elderly people attractive targets for criminals who understood how to exploit fears about financial security during old age. The photograph she had commissioned documented not just the evidence of fraud, but also the human impact on victims who had lost savings they could not afford to lose. The confidence scheme had been perpetrated by Catherine Morrison, a woman who had developed sophisticated understanding of how to gain the trust of elderly people by presenting herself as someone who shared their concerns about economic security and social isolation. Her criminal organization had included accomplices who provided references, testimonials, and other forms of social proof that made the fraudulent investment opportunities seem legitimate and trustworthy. Catherine Morrison's arrest. Photographs showed a woman whose appearance and demeanor had been carefully cultivated to inspire confidence in elderly people who were looking for someone they could trust with their financial futures. Detective Santos's investigation had revealed the psychological techniques that made confidence crimes possible, including the exploitation of loneliness and fear that characterized the lives of many elderly people during an era when family support systems were often inadequate and social services were minimal. The case had concluded with Catherine Morrison's conviction for fraud and her sentence to state prison. But the photographs preserved in the case file also documented the community response to a crime that had revealed the vulnerability of elderly residents who needed better protection and support than existing institutions provided. As the night deepened toward its furthest point from dawn, Detective Chun continued through the photography archive, discovering images that captured moments of human drama that had been preserved with the formal dignity that characterized official documentation during eras when crime scene photography was considered a specialized skill that required both technical expertise and artistic sensitivity. The photographs would continue to wait in their climate-controlled storage, preserving visual evidence of crimes that had once commanded community attention, but now existed only in the patient silence of official archives. Each image was a window into a moment that had been considered significant enough to document permanently, creating a visual history of criminal justice that paralleled the written records maintained in the floors above and the basement chambers below. The photographs had aged like memories themselves, their black and white certainty fading to shades of gray that whispered rather than declared the moments they had captured decades ago. Sleeping inside dusty cabinets where time moved differently and preservation was the only priority. Waiting for someone with the patience to look closely at images that had been created to bear witness to human behavior and institutional response, one carefully composed frame at a time.